On her wedding day, Isabella is left standing alone at the altar when her groom, the heir to the powerful Caruso family, vanishes without a word. All he leaves behind is an envelope of cash and a one-way plane ticket, shattering her heart and reputation overnight. You are listening to a story exclusively narrated on the Mafia Romance channel. Relax and step into the world of love stories filled with mystery, emotions, and passion. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to support us. The cathedral smelled of white lilies and candle wax, and Isabella Moretti thought, absurdly, that she would remember that smell for the rest of her life. She was right, though not for the reasons she imagined at 3:24, standing at the back of Santa Chiara in a dress that had cost more than her mother's car, waiting for the doors to open. 600 guests filled the pews. Silk and diamonds and old money sat shoulder to shoulder with new money trying to look old. The Caruso family had not built an empire by being subtle, and their only son's wedding was not going to be the exception. Isabella had counted the flower arrangements that morning out of nervous habit. 42, white roses and lily of the valley flown in from Ecuador, and she counted them again now because counting was easier than feeling the way her hands had started to shake. "You look like a painting," her father said beside her, his arm rigid under her fingers, his voice thick. Salvatore Moretti was not a man given to sentiment. He ran 3 restaurants and a produce distribution company, and he had spent the last year negotiating this marriage like it was a contract. Because in every way that mattered to the two families involved, it was. But even he had gone quiet when she'd stepped out of the dressing room that morning, and quiet, from her father, was the closest thing to poetry he possessed. "Papa, if I faint, catch me before the veil does something ridiculous." He laughed, and the sound cracked just slightly at the edges. "You have never fainted in your life, Isabella. You threatened to hit your cousin Dino with a candlestick when he called off his engagement to you, in front of the entire town. You are not a woman who faints." She should have taken that as a warning about herself. Instead, she smiled, because in 20 minutes she was going to marry Marco Caruso, and for 11 months she had let herself believe that a marriage arranged over dinner between 2 powerful families could somehow, impossibly, also be the love story she'd wanted, since she was young enough to still believe in them. She had not been wrong to believe it. That was the cruelest part, though she wouldn't understand it for 3 more years. Marco Caruso, heir to an empire whose true business no one at that wedding said aloud, had looked at her the way no man had ever looked at her. Not like she was an asset to a merger, but like she was the only unguarded thing in his life. He had a reputation for being cold, ice water in his veins, people said, the kind of man who could watch another man's hands broken and not blink. But with her, in the 11 months of their courtship, he had been quiet and careful and almost helplessly attentive, the way a man is when he has spent his whole life being handled and has finally found someone he wants to hold instead. The Monsignor appeared at the front of the cathedral. The string quartet lifted their bows. Somewhere behind the heavy oak doors, Isabella heard her bridesmaids shift into position, heard the low, excited murmur of the crowd settle into the particular silence that means an audience is ready. The doors did not open. She waited. 90 seconds is nothing in ordinary time. In wedding time, with 100 eyes about to turn and the first violin note already hanging in the air, 90 seconds is an eternity with teeth. The wedding coordinator, a small, severe woman named Renata, who had not once in 11 months of planning shown anything resembling panic, pressed her earpiece and turned pale. "Mr. Caruso isn't at the altar," she said. Isabella's father's arm went rigid under her hand. "He's late. Grooms are late." "Sir, his best man can't find him. He's not answering his phone. His car is gone from the valet line." The first ugly ripple moved through Isabella's chest, a cold current under warm water. She would spend years trying to describe that feeling to herself and never quite manage it. The specific, physical sensation of a life dividing itself into before and after, while you are still standing in your wedding dress with white roses in your hands. They waited 40 minutes. 40 minutes in a side room meant for brides to compose themselves before their triumphant walk, 40 minutes while her mother wept quietly into a handkerchief and her father made increasingly furious phone calls that no one answered. 40 minutes while 600 guests outside began to whisper, then to murmur, then, she could hear it even through the door, to laugh. The particular cruel laughter of people who sense a spectacle unfolding and cannot quite believe their luck. It was Marco's own father, Don Vittorio Caruso, who finally came to find her. He was a broad, silver-templed man, whose calm had always struck Isabella as the calm of a mountain rather than a person, immovable because it had never needed to move. That calm was gone now. He looked, for the first time since she'd known him, like an old man. "Isabella," he said her name like an apology. "I don't have an explanation. I don't have my son. I have men searching the city right now, and I will find him. But I cannot stand at that altar and pretend I know why he isn't standing beside you." "Where is he?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which she would later understand was its own kind of shock. "Vittorio, where is your son?" "I don't know," he said. And for a man who had spent 40 years knowing everything that happened within 100 miles of his territory, the admission seemed to cost him something physical. It was a courier, not Marco, who delivered the envelope. A boy of maybe 19, uncomfortable in a rented tuxedo, who wouldn't meet Isabella's eyes when he handed it to Renata and fled the room like the building was on fire. Inside was $50,000 in cash, banded in neat paper straps, and a single one-way plane ticket to Isabella's name, departing from a private airfield 2 hours from the city, destination blank, to be filled in when she arrived. There was no note, no signature, nothing in Marco's handwriting, nothing that smelled of him, nothing that explained a single second of the 11 months he had spent convincing her that this, the two of them, together, was the truest thing either of them would ever have. She stood in that side room in her wedding dress, holding an envelope of money like it was supposed to mean something, and she understood, with the particular clarity that only comes once or twice in a life, that she had been abandoned. Outside, the 600 guests were still waiting, restless now, the murmur curdling towards something closer to a jeer. Somewhere in that crowd was a Caruso rival, a woman named Serena Volpe, who would later be photographed leaving the reception hall smiling, a detail Isabella would not learn until years afterward, when it would explain far more than she wanted it to. Her father found her sitting on the floor of the dressing room, veil crumpled beside her, the envelope of money still sealed in her lap. because she could not bring herself to open it further, could not bring herself to count the humiliation in $100 bills. "I'm going to burn this cathedral down," Salvatore said, with the flat calm of a man who meant it literally. "Don't." Isabella's voice was hoarse from crying she didn't remember starting. "Just take me home, Papa. Please, just take me home." She did not know, as her father wrapped his jacket around her shoulders and walked her past 600 whispering guests and out into the grey afternoon, that Marco Caruso was at that exact moment 3 floors below the reception hall in a service tunnel, watching security footage of a man he did not recognize checking a rifle case behind the choir loft. A man who had been paid, he would later learn, $200,000 by Serena Volpe to put a bullet through Isabella Moretti's chest the moment she said, "I do," as a message to the Caruso family about what happened to those who refused to share power. He did not know, as he sat in that dress shirt already soaked through with sweat, making the hardest phone call of his life to a contact who could get a woman out of the country within the hour, that he was choosing to let the only person in the world who mattered to him believe he was a coward, because the alternative was watching her get comfortable in the belief that she was safe when she was not, watching her die at an altar in a dress the colour of surrender. He did not know that it would take 3 years to undo what he did in that half hour. He only knew, watching from the shadows of a service corridor as Isabella Moretti walked out of Santa Chiara alone, that he had just broken the only good thing that had ever happened to him in order to save her life. The story that circulated through the city over the following weeks took on the particular mythology reserved for scandals involving beautiful women and powerful men. By the time it had passed through enough dinner parties and beauty salons and the kind of society columns that pretended not to be gossip, it had calcified into a single sentence. Marco Caruso left Isabella Moretti at the altar because he found someone better. No one asked why a man engaged to be married for 11 months, a man who by every account had been visibly, almost embarrassingly devoted to his bride, would vanish 2 hours before the ceremony without so much as a phone call. No one asked why the Caruso family, famous for controlling every narrative that touched their name, allowed this particular story to run unchecked through the city like a fever. No one asked, because the truth, if anyone had guessed at it, would have been far more dangerous to know than a simple story about a man who got cold feet. Isabella spent the first week in her childhood bedroom with the curtains drawn, surfacing only for the bathroom and the rare bowl of soup her mother left outside her door because she couldn't bring herself to knock. She did not cry after the first day. Crying required a kind of hope that the thing you were crying about might still be fixed. And by the second morning, lying in a bed she'd slept in as a teenager, staring at the same water stain on the ceiling she'd stared at during 100 adolescent heartbreaks, Isabella understood there was nothing left to fix. A man had looked her in the eyes the night before their wedding, held her face in his hands, and told her that she was the only thing he had ever wanted that had nothing to do with his family's business. Then he had disappeared into that business so completely that he left an envelope of cash instead of an explanation, as if she were an employee he was terminating rather than the woman he claimed to love. Her mother, Carmela, was the one who eventually pulled the curtains open. "You cannot decide at 24 that your life is over because a man is a coward," she said, standing at the foot of the bed with the particular ferocity of a woman who had buried her own disappointments under decades of good posture. I did not raise you to disappear into a bedroom. I raised you to be a woman men are afraid of. Men aren't afraid of me, Mama. They leave me standing at altars in front of 600 people. One man did that, and he will answer for it someday, to God, if not to your father. Carmela sat on the edge of the bed and took her daughter's hand, the gesture so gentle it nearly undid the fragile composure Isabella had spent all morning constructing. But you will not give him 3 years of mourning for something that took him 11 months to build and 30 seconds to destroy. You are going to get up. You are going to eat something that is not broth. And then you are going to decide what kind of woman you want the rest of your life to see when they look at you. It took longer than Carmela's speech implied. Grief rarely obeys deadlines, but something in her mother's words lodged itself in Isabella and refused to leave. 3 weeks after the wedding that never happened, she opened the envelope of cash Marco had left behind, counted it in full for the first time, and used it to buy a plane ticket of her own, not the blank one he'd provided, choosing instead a destination entirely her decision, entirely away from a city that had watched her humiliation with open enjoyment. She told her parents she was going to New York. She did not tell them because she did not yet know herself that she was also 6 weeks pregnant, a fact she would not confirm until she was already 3,000 miles away, standing in a pharmacy bathroom with a positive test in her shaking hand and no one to call. The Caruso family, for their part, closed ranks with the totality of an empire protecting its wounded flank. Don Vittorio gave one statement to the press, that his son had personal matters requiring his immediate and indefinite absence, and then said nothing further to anyone for 3 years. Marco's mother, Adriana, was seen at church every Sunday with her rosary and her composure, never once acknowledging the whispers that followed her down the aisle. If anyone in that family knew where Marco had gone or why, they carried the knowledge like a vault carries its contents, sealed, guarded, and utterly silent. What almost no one in the city knew, what only 3 people alive would know for the next 3 years, was that Marco Caruso had not run from his wedding. He had run toward the only thing that mattered more to him than his own reputation, the certainty that Isabella Moretti would still be breathing the next morning and every morning after that, even if it meant she believed, for the rest of her life if necessary, that he had never loved her at all. He watched her leave the city from a car parked 3 blocks from her parents' house the night before her flight to New York. He did not approach her. He had a man watching the airfield, a man watching the flight manifest, a man whose only job was to confirm that Isabella Moretti had boarded her plane, and that no one connected to Serena Volpe, no one connected to the dozen enemies his family had accumulated over 3 generations of blood and business, had followed her onto it. When the confirmation came through, 3 words on an encrypted line, "She is safe," Marco Caruso sat alone in that car, outside the house where the woman he loved slept for the last time in her childhood bed, and he allowed himself, for exactly 4 minutes, to grieve the life he had just destroyed in order to save it. Then he drove to the airfield, where his own plane was waiting, and he disappeared into a life built entirely around one obsession: finding every person responsible for the plot against her, and making certain that when, not if, When he came back for her, there would be nothing left standing between them but the wreckage he alone had chosen to walk through first. New York had taught Isabella Moretti how to build a life out of spite, and she was grateful for the lesson, even on the days it nearly broke her. She arrived with a suitcase, an envelope of guilt money she refused to touch beyond the plane ticket, and a pregnancy she hadn't told a single soul about. She rented a studio apartment in Astoria that smelled permanently of the Greek bakery downstairs, took a job as a hostess at an Italian restaurant in Manhattan because it was the only skill she had that didn't require explaining a broken engagement, and spent her nights studying event coordination textbooks she'd bought used from a college bookstore, because if there was one thing 11 months of planning her own wedding had taught her, it was that she had a talent for making beautiful things happen under pressure. Sophia was born on a Tuesday in late February, 7 pounds 2 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and eyes that would, over the following months, settle into an unmistakable green. Not Isabella's brown, not anyone in the Moretti family's blue-grey, but a clear, striking green that Isabella recognized every time she looked at her daughter's face, because she had spent 11 months looking into eyes exactly that colour across a candlelit table. She never once considered not keeping the pregnancy. Whatever Marco Caruso had done, whatever coward's calculation had led him to leave her at that altar, the child growing inside her had nothing to do with his failures. Sophia was hers, entirely, fiercely hers, and Isabella built the next 3 years of her life around the singular goal of making sure her daughter never had reason to feel like a consolation prize for anyone. The event coordination business started small. A friend from the restaurant needed help with a birthday party. A regular customer, impressed by how effortlessly Isabella had handled a difficult table of 8, asked her to plan an anniversary dinner. Word spread the way it does among people with money and no time, quietly, through recommendation, through the particular currency of, "You have to use this woman, she's a miracle." By the end of her second year in New York, Isabella Moretti Events had a client list that included 2 minor celebrities, a state senator's 50th birthday, and a standing contract with a boutique hotel in Midtown that wanted her to design their entire seasonal event calendar. She did not date. She told herself this was practical. A newborn and a growing business left no room for romance. But on the rare nights Sophia slept through and Isabella lay awake in her apartment listening to the bakery's exhaust fan hum through the wall, she knew it was something closer to a wound that hadn't finished healing. She had loved a man completely, had believed herself loved completely in return, and had learned in the space of 30 seconds outside a cathedral that belief was not the same as truth. It made her cautious in a way she hadn't been before. Not bitter, exactly, because bitterness required energy she didn't have to spare, but guarded, careful. A woman who kept the important rooms of herself locked, even when she smiled. She thought about Marco less than she expected to in the ordinary hours of ordinary days. Motherhood and building a business from nothing left little room for nostalgia. But there were moments. Sophia's green eyes catching afternoon light, a stranger's cologne on a subway platform, the particular way certain men held themselves in expensive suits that would ambush her without warning. And for a few seconds she would be 24 again, standing in a wedding dress with an envelope of cash in her hands, understanding for the first time that the ground beneath her could simply vanish. She never learned, in those 3 years, that Marco Caruso had spent every one of them dismantling, piece by piece, the network responsible for the assassination plot against her. She never learned that he had traced the money back through 4 shell companies to Serena Volpe, that he had spent 8 months undercover in a rival family's organization to confirm the connection, that he had killed 2 men with his own hands in the process, not for vengeance, though vengeance was in there somewhere, tangled with the rest of it, but because each of those men represented a thread that, left unpulled, could someday lead back to her. She did not know that he kept a photograph of her, an old one, from an engagement party 8 months before the wedding, her head thrown back, laughing at something out of frame, in the inside pocket of every jacket he owned, that he had looked at it every single night for 3 years, the way other men said prayers. She did not know that her father, Salvatore, had received a single phone call 18 months into her absence, a call from a blocked number, a man's voice asking only one question: "Is she safe?" before hanging up, without waiting for an answer, because the sound of Salvatore's voice confirming it was enough. She knew only that she had survived, that her daughter was thriving, that the business she'd built from a hostess stand and a stolen dream had grown into something that was entirely, undeniably hers. And when her mother called on a Sunday afternoon in early June, 3 years and 4 months after the wedding that never happened, to tell her that her father had suffered a heart attack, not fatal but serious enough that the doctors were using words like rest and recovery and family nearby, Isabella did not hesitate. She booked a flight for herself and Sophia within the hour, packed 2 suitcases in a single evening, and told herself that returning to the city that had watched her humiliation would be nothing more than a temporary obligation. She had no way of knowing that the city she was returning to had spent 3 years waiting for her, in the person of a man who had never once stopped. The city looked smaller than she remembered, the way places from childhood always do once you've lived somewhere with taller buildings and faster trains. Isabella stood at the airport arrivals curb, with Sophia's small hand in hers and a duffel bag over one shoulder, and felt the particular vertigo of a person stepping back into a life she'd deliberately outgrown. "Is this where you got married, Mommy?" Sophia asked, 3 years old and possessed of the unnerving directness of children who have absorbed more than adults realize. "This is where I grew up, baby." Isabella had told her daughter almost nothing about Marco, only that her father lived far away and wasn't part of their lives, a sentence she'd rehearsed enough times that it no longer caught in her throat when she said it. "Nonno is sick, so we're going to stay for a little while and help take care of him." Her mother met them at her parents' house with a fierceness of hugging that nearly knocked Isabella off balance, and then immediately crouched down to inspect her granddaughter with the reverent disbelief of a woman meeting a miracle in person for the first time. "Madonna, look at you," Carmela breathed, cupping Sophia's face in both hands. "Look at those eyes." Something flickered across her mother's expression, a half-second of recognition quickly suppressed, that Isabella chose not to examine too closely. She had spent 3 years not examining it too closely. It was easier that way. Salvatore was recovering well, all things considered. The heart attack had been serious, but not catastrophic, and the doctors were optimistic about a full recovery, with rest and lifestyle changes he grumbled about, but privately intended to make. Isabella spent the first week settling into her childhood home with a toddler and the strange doubled sensation of being simultaneously 24 and 27. Simultaneously, the humiliated bride and the woman who'd rebuilt herself into someone that girl wouldn't have recognized. She avoided the parts of the city that held the sharpest memories. She did not drive past Santa Chiara. She did not accept her mother's gentle suggestions to reconnect with old friends who might, inevitably, ask questions she had no interest in answering. She told herself this visit would be brief, a month, 6 weeks at most, long enough to see her father stable and then back to New York, back to the life and the business and the careful equilibrium she'd built. The city, however, had other plans, the way cities run by families like the Carusos always do. It was her second week back when she took Sophia to the small public park 2 blocks from her parents' house, the same park where she'd spent childhood afternoons, and found herself standing at the edge of the playground, watching her daughter navigate the slide with the fearless confidence of a 3-year-old who had not yet learned that falling hurt. The afternoon was warm, golden-edged, ordinary in the way afternoons rarely stayed ordinary in Isabella's life for long. She noticed the car before she understood why she noticed it. A black sedan parked across the street, engine idling, windows tinted dark enough that she couldn't see the driver. It was the kind of vehicle she'd grown up around without ever thinking twice about. The kind that belonged to men whose business was conducted in low voices behind closed doors. She had not thought about that world in 3 years. She had spent considerable effort not thinking about it. The car sat there for 11 minutes. She counted, the old habit resurfacing without permission, her wedding day compulsion for counting things as a way of managing fear. When it finally pulled away, she told herself it meant nothing. A man waiting for someone, a driver on a break. The city was full of black sedans. It did not follow that every one of them belonged to the family that had once, briefly, nearly become her own. She was wrong about that, though it would take her another 2 weeks to learn how wrong. That evening, after Sophia was asleep and her parents had retired early, Isabella sat on the back porch with a glass of wine she'd allowed herself as a small rebellion against the day's low-grade unease, and found herself doing something she hadn't done in longer than she wanted to admit, thinking, deliberately, about Marco Caruso. Not the ambush memory version that arrived unbidden on subway platforms, but a considered, examined thought, the kind she'd spent 3 years avoiding because it required acknowledging a question she'd never let herself ask directly. Why? Not how could he? Not what was wrong with me? Just why? The single word she'd circled around for 3 years without ever landing on it, because landing on it meant admitting there might be an answer she hadn't considered, and admitting that meant reopening a wound she'd worked very hard to convince herself had scarred over cleanly. She did not know, sitting on that porch with her wine going warm in her hand, that the man she was thinking about was, at that exact moment, 2 miles away, in a penthouse office overlooking the city, staring at a photograph on his desk of a laughing woman at an engagement party, having just received a report from a man in his employ that Isabella Moretti had returned to the city, that she had a daughter, 3 years old, with green eyes. She did not know that Marco Caruso had gone completely, dangerously still when he heard that detail, the way men go still, right before they do something they cannot undo. She only knew, finishing her wine and going inside to check on her sleeping daughter, that something in the air of this city had shifted since her arrival, and that whatever it was, she had a feeling, the old, animal kind of feeling she'd learned not to ignore, that it was only just beginning. The gala was her mother's idea, in the way that most disruptions to Isabella's careful plans tended to be her mother's idea. A charity fundraiser for the Children's Hospital held at the Regency Grand Hotel, the kind of event Isabella had spent 3 years building a career designing, and Carmela had insisted, with the particular relentlessness of an Italian mother who believed her daughter's confidence needed a public reintroduction to society, that Isabella attend, if only to remind the city that Isabella Moretti had become someone worth talking about for reasons that had nothing to do with an abandoned wedding. "You built a business from nothing," Carmela said, holding up a deep emerald dress against Isabella's frame with the critical eye of a woman assessing battle armor. "You have a beautiful daughter. You are not the girl who got left at the altar anymore. Let them see that." Isabella agreed, eventually, mostly because arguing with her mother required more energy than simply attending a party for 3 hours. She told herself it would be easy. Walk in, make polite conversation, support the hospital, walk out. She did not anticipate that the guest list for a charity gala hosted by the city's oldest families would, inevitably, include the Carusos, because the Carusos funded half the wings of that hospital and had for 2 generations. She saw him before he saw her, or so she believed in the version of the story she would tell herself afterward, though she would later suspect he'd known the exact moment she walked in, because Marco Caruso did not miss things, and he had certainly not missed the door for the entirety of the evening. He was standing near the bar in a black suit that fit him with the precision of a man who'd had it tailored that week. A glass of scotch untouched in his hand, deep in conversation with 2 men Isabella didn't recognize. 3 years had changed him in ways that hollowed something out of her chest. He was leaner, harder, a scar she didn't remember cutting a thin line through one eyebrow. His dark hair cropped shorter than he'd worn it at 27, but the eyes were the same. The same eyes she'd looked into across a candlelit table for 11 months. The same eyes, she realized with a jolt that nearly buckled her knees, that looked back at her every time she watched her daughter sleep. He turned. Their eyes met across the ballroom, and the entire room, the string quartet, the murmur of 400 guests, the clink of champagne flutes, seemed to fall away into a silence so complete Isabella could hear her own pulse in her ears. Marco Caruso went very, very still. She should have left. Every instinct she'd built over 3 years, every careful wall she'd constructed, told her to turn around and walk out before he crossed the room, because she could see, even from 30 feet away, that he was going to cross the room. She stayed anyway, rooted to the marble floor in her emerald dress, because some traitorous part of her, the part that had spent 3 years not fully believing the story she'd told herself about hatred, needed to see what he would do. He did not hesitate the way she expected. He walked directly to her, cutting through the crowd with the singular focus of a man who had stopped noticing obstacles existed, and stopped close enough that she could smell the same cologne he'd worn to their engagement party, close enough that she had to tilt her chin up to hold his gaze. Isabella. Her name in his voice, after 3 years, hit her like a physical blow. "Don't." Her voice came out steadier than she felt, the same steadiness that had carried her out of that cathedral 3 years ago. Don't you dare say my name like you have any right to it." "You're right." His jaw tightened, something raw moving behind his eyes that she didn't remember him ever allowing her to see, even during their engagement, even at his most vulnerable. "I don't have the right. I never stopped." "Stop!" She held up a hand, and it was shaking, and she hated that it was shaking, hated that 3 years and an ocean of distance hadn't been enough to steady it in his presence. "I don't want an explanation. I don't want an apology. I built a life, Marco, a good one. I have a daughter I love more than anything, a career I'm proud of, and I did all of it without you. Because you made it very clear, in a cathedral in front of 600 people, that I was never worth an explanation to begin with." Something crossed his face at a daughter, a flicker so brief she might have imagined it, if she hadn't spent 11 months learning to read every microscopic shift in his expression. "A daughter," he repeated, quiet, careful, the words landing like stones dropped into still water. "Yes. Sophia. She's 3. Isabella watched him do the math, watched the exact second the arithmetic landed, watched something detonate silently behind his eyes that she couldn't yet name because she didn't yet understand what she'd just handed him. "Isabella." His voice had changed entirely, stripped of the composed authority he'd walked toward her with, replaced by something that sounded terrifyingly like hope. "I need to see her." "No." The word came out sharper than she intended, fear and fury tangled together in a way she didn't have time to sort through in a crowded ballroom. "You don't get to disappear for 3 years and then decide on a random Tuesday at a charity gala that you want to be a father. That is not how this works." "I know I don't deserve—" "You're right. You don't." She stepped back, putting distance between them that felt both necessary and, treacherously, like the hardest thing she'd done in years. "Stay away from us, Marco. I mean it. Whatever you think you owe me, whatever guilt you've been carrying around for 3 years, keep it. I don't need it. I don't need you." She turned and walked away before he could answer, before the traitorous part of her chest could betray the fact that some part of her, small, buried, furious at its own persistence, wanted very badly to hear whatever he'd been about to say. Behind her, Marco Caruso stood motionless in the middle of a crowded ballroom, watching the woman he had spent 3 years loving from a distance walk away from him for the second time, and understood. With the particular clarity of a man who has just learned he has a daughter he never knew existed, that whatever careful plan he'd built for how their reunion would unfold had just become entirely, irrevocably obsolete. Isabella didn't remember the drive home. She remembered gripping the steering wheel hard enough that her knuckles ached, remembered pulling into her parents' driveway and sitting in the dark car for nearly 10 minutes before she trusted her legs to carry her inside without shaking. And she remembered standing over Sophia's small sleeping form in the guest room, watching her daughter's chest rise and fall, trying to reconcile the fact that the man she'd just told to stay away from them was the same man whose eyes looked back at her from her daughter's face every single day. She did not sleep. She lay in her childhood bed, staring at the same water-stained ceiling from 3 years ago, and for the first time since the wedding that never happened, allowed herself to think in full, uninterrupted detail about that day. Not the humiliation, which she'd relived 1,000 times, but the specific texture of the man she'd loved. The way he'd looked at her the night before the wedding when he thought she wasn't watching. An intensity that had struck her even then as almost desperate, though she hadn't had the vocabulary to name it at the time. "I need to see her," he'd said, and the raw, unpracticed want in his voice had not sounded like guilt. It had sounded like grief. She hated that she'd noticed the difference. Her mother found her at the kitchen table at 6 the next morning, hollow-eyed over a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. "You saw him," Carmela said. It wasn't a question. "How did you know?" "Because you have the same face you had 3 years ago, the morning of the wedding, before anything went wrong. The face you make when you're trying very hard not to feel something." Carmela sat across from her, folding her hands with the deliberate patience of a woman who had learned over 60 years exactly how much silence a difficult conversation required before it could bear weight. "What did he say?" "He asked to see Sophia." Isabella's voice cracked on the last word, the first crack she'd allowed herself since the ballroom. "Mama, he did the math. In front of me. I watched him realize she's his, and I don't know what to do with that. I spent 3 years telling myself he didn't deserve to know she existed, and now he knows, and I have no idea what happens next." Carmela reached across the table and took her daughter's hand, the same gesture from 3 years ago, the same gentleness that had once nearly undone her. "Do you want to know something I never told you? Something I probably should have told you before your wedding, and didn't, because your father asked me to stay quiet, and I have regretted it every day since." Isabella went very still. "What?" "The week before your wedding, Marco came to see your father. Alone, no bodyguards, no announcement. He showed up at the restaurant after close and asked to speak with him privately. Your father wouldn't tell me everything that was said, but I know Marco left that conversation looking like a man who had just been handed a death sentence. And I know your father spent the rest of that week making phone calls he wouldn't explain, arguing with people on the other end of the line in a voice I hadn't heard him use since before you were born." Carmela's grip tightened. "I always believed something happened in that week, Isabella. Something that had nothing to do with Marco falling out of love with you. I just never had proof, and by the time I thought to look for it, you were already in New York, and I didn't want to reopen a wound that seemed, finally, to be closing." Isabella sat with that information like a stone dropped into her chest, sinking slowly through 3 years of carefully constructed certainty. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you came home from that gala with the face of a woman who is about to make a decision, and I would rather you make it with all the information available than half of it." Carmela stood, kissed the top of her daughter's head, and left her alone at the table with a cup of cold coffee and a question that had just cracked open 3 years of grief she wasn't remotely prepared to relitigate. She did not call Marco that day. She told herself it was because she needed time, needed to process, needed to protect the fortress of her own careful equilibrium before she let anyone, especially him, inside its walls again. But she spent the day distracted, snapping at herself for burning dinner, forgetting a work call with a New York client, watching Sophia play in the backyard with an attention so intense it bordered on surveillance, as if she could somehow read the answer to every unresolved question in her daughter's careless 3-year-old laughter. It was Marco who made the next move, 2 days later, in the form of a letter. Not an email, not a text, an actual handwritten letter delivered by a man in a dark suit who left it in her parents' mailbox and drove away without a word. Isabella recognized the handwriting instantly. She'd received 100 small love notes in that same careful, slightly slanted script during their engagement, tucked into flower arrangements and left on her pillow, and seeing it again after 3 years hit her with a force that nearly buckled her knees on her parents' front porch. Isabella, I am not asking you to forgive me, and I am not asking you to believe anything I say without proof, because I know I have given you no reason to extend either. I am asking for 1 hour of your time, in a place of your choosing, with any protection you feel you need present, so that I can tell you the truth about what happened 3 years ago. Not the version the city believes, the truth. I will not mention Sophia in this letter, beyond saying that I understand, completely, if you never want me anywhere near her. That will be your decision, and I will respect it absolutely, whatever it costs me. But you deserve to know why I did what I did, even if the knowing changes nothing about what comes next. 1 hour, wherever, whenever you choose. I will be waiting. Isabella read the letter 4 times on her parents' front porch, and then a 5th time sitting on Sophia's bed after her daughter had fallen asleep. And by the time she finally set it down on her nightstand, she understood that whatever careful equilibrium she'd built over 3 years had just cracked wide enough to let the truth through, whether she was ready for it or not. She chose a private room at her father's restaurant, closed for a Monday deep clean, because it was neutral ground that still belonged, in some fundamental way, to her. She brought no bodyguard. Some instinct told her Marco wouldn't allow her to be unsafe in his presence, even if she wanted to be. An instinct she distrusted and obeyed anyway. But she did bring her father, who sat in the corner with his arms crossed, and the particular stillness of a man ready to become violent on short notice. Marco arrived exactly on time, alone, wearing a dark sweater instead of the tailored suits she remembered. A detail that struck her as strange until she realized it was deliberate. He'd dressed down, made himself smaller, less like the heir to an empire and more like the man she'd fallen in love with, before she'd fully understood what that empire meant. Salvatore. He nodded to her father, respectful, careful. Thank you for allowing this. I'm not allowing anything, Salvatore said flatly. I'm here to make sure you don't lie to my daughter a second time. Talk. Marco sat across from Isabella at the small table, close enough that she could see the tension coiled through his shoulders. And for a long moment he said nothing at all, as if the truth he'd carried for 3 years had grown too large to fit through the door of his mouth on the first attempt. 9 days before our wedding, he finally began, I received information from a man I trusted inside a rival family's organization. A woman named Serena Volpe, you may remember her, she attended the wedding, had approached him with an offer. $200,000 to place a shooter in the choir loft of Santa Chiara during our ceremony. The target wasn't me. His jaw worked, the words costing him visibly. The target was you. The moment you said I do, she wanted you dead, in front of 600 witnesses, as a message to my family about the cost of refusing to share territory with hers. The room went silent enough that Isabella could hear the restaurant's walk-in cooler humming through the wall. I didn't believe it at first, Marco continued. I thought it was a rival trying to destabilize the wedding, spread fear, nothing more. But I had my own people verify it independently, and by 6 days before the wedding, I had confirmation from 3 separate sources. A shooter had already been contracted. The weapon was already in the city. Serena Volpe wanted you dead at that altar, and there was nothing legal, nothing official, no police force or private security detail that could stop a hired professional from succeeding, because the plot was too well insulated, too many layers between the trigger and the money. "So you ran," Isabella said, her voice flat, testing the shape of the accusation, even as something in her chest was already beginning to understand it was wrong. "I disappeared you," Marco corrected, leaning forward. "I couldn't cancel the wedding without alerting Serena that we knew. She had someone inside my own security detail. I learned that later. Someone feeding her information about every move my family made. If I'd called off the ceremony, she would have simply waited, retargeted, found another moment when you were less protected. The only way to guarantee you survived was to make it look like I had abandoned you, publicly, humiliatingly, so completely that no one, not Serena, not anyone watching, would ever suspect it was a rescue. I needed you 3,000 miles away, under a name that couldn't be traced back to me, before anyone realized the wedding wasn't happening because I'd found out about the plot." Isabella sat very still, 3 years of carefully constructed hatred cracking open piece by piece with every sentence. "You could have told me, and risked you reacting in a way that alerted the man inside my security detail. Isabella, I had 6 days. 6 days to build an extraction plan, verify a threat, and protect you from an enemy who had eyes inside my own house. I made the call that I believed gave you the best chance of surviving, and I have spent 3 years telling myself it was the right one, even though every single day of it felt like dying." His voice broke, just slightly, on the last word, and it was the first crack in his composure Isabella had seen since he'd walked into the room. "I watched you walk out of that cathedral alone, Isabella. I was in the building. I was 30 feet away, watching from a service corridor, and I could not go to you, could not explain, could not do anything except let you believe I was a coward, because the alternative was watching you get comfortable enough to believe you were safe when you weren't." "Why didn't you come back? After, once the immediate threat was handled, why did it take 3 years?" "Because the threat was never handled quickly. Serena Volpe didn't stop after the wedding failed to happen. She retreated, regrouped, and spent 3 years building a larger network, using the money she'd already committed to finish what she started. Except now, the target wasn't just you. It was anyone connected to me who could be used as leverage. I spent 3 years dismantling that network, piece by piece, because I could not bring you back into my life, could not even let you know I was alive to you, until I was certain that doing so wouldn't put you directly back in the crosshairs." He looked at her then, with an intensity that made her chest ache. "I am not finished. I want you to understand that, because it matters for what comes next. Serena Volpe is still alive, still dangerous. And now that you're back in this city, now that anyone paying attention can see you exist, I have to assume she knows exactly what I know, that you're the one weakness I have never been able to eliminate." Salvatore, who had been silent through the entire explanation, finally spoke, his voice rough. "You're telling me my daughter is in danger? Again?" "I'm telling you I intend to make certain she isn't," Marco said, and something in his voice, cold, absolute, the voice of a man who had killed for less, sent a chill through the room that had nothing to do with fear of him and everything to do with the terrifying clarity of what he was capable of on her behalf. Isabella sat across from the man she had spent 3 years hating, understanding for the first time that hatred had never been the right word for what she'd been carrying, that underneath it the entire time had been something far more complicated. Grief for a love that had been real, buried under a betrayal that had never actually happened the way she believed it had. I need time, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I believe you. God help me, I believe every word of it. But believing you doesn't undo 3 years, Marco. It doesn't undo Sophia growing up without knowing her father existed. It doesn't undo the wedding I never got to have, or the humiliation I lived through in front of this entire city. I need time to figure out what any of this means. Take whatever time you need. Marco stood, and for a moment she thought he might reach for her hand across the table. But he didn't, holding himself back with visible effort. But Isabella, please, let me help protect you and Sophia while you take it. Whatever else you decide about us, I am not willing to gamble with either of your lives while Serena Volpe is still out there. That isn't a request I'm willing to negotiate. She didn't answer him directly, but she didn't say no either. And as he left the private room with the same careful, controlled composure he'd walked in with, Isabella understood that whatever wall she'd spent 3 years building around her heart had just developed a crack wide enough that she was no longer certain it would hold. The black sedan appeared again 2 days later, this time parked directly outside her parents' house instead of across the street from the park. And this time, Isabella did not tell herself it meant nothing. She was loading Sophia into her car for a pediatrician appointment when she noticed it, engine off, a man in sunglasses sitting motionless behind the wheel in a way that made her skin prickle with an animal wariness she hadn't felt since the week before her wedding, when Marco had grown strange and distant without explanation, and she'd chalked it up to nerves instead of the truth she now knew. She got Sophia into her car seat with hands that only shook slightly, backed out of the driveway with deliberate calm, and watched in her rearview mirror as the black sedan pulled out behind her, maintaining a careful 2-car distance, the unmistakable pattern of a tail. Her first instinct was panic. Her second, faster instinct, the one that had carried her through a public humiliation and a solo pregnancy and the ground-up construction of an entire career, was to call the one person who had explicitly told her 48 hours earlier that he intended to make certain she and Sophia were protected. Marco answered on the first ring. Isabella, there's a black sedan following me. I have Sophia in the car. Her voice was steadier than her hands. I don't know if it's the same one I saw at the park last week, but I don't think that's a coincidence anymore. Where are you? His voice had transformed instantly. Every trace of the careful, apologetic man from the restaurant burned away into something sharp and immediate. Exact location, now. She told him. He gave her a set of directions, a route to a public garage attached to a hotel 2 blocks from her pediatrician's office, a building she recognized as one the Caruso family had significant interests in, and told her to drive there directly, not stopping, not slowing, and that he would have men there before she arrived. He did. When Isabella pulled into the garage, tires screeching slightly on the tight turn, she found 4 men in dark suits already positioned near the entrance, and Marco himself standing beside a black SUV of his own, his face carved from something that looked less like concern and more like barely restrained violence. He reached her car before she'd fully put it in park, opening her door with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the coiled tension radiating from every line of his body. Are you hurt? Is she hurt? We're fine. He never got close, he just... Isabella's composure finally cracked, 3 years of careful control fracturing under the weight of the last 10 minutes. He was just there, Marco, sitting outside my parents' house like he had every right to be, and I didn't know what to do except drive. You did exactly the right thing. He crouched down to Sophia's car seat, and Isabella watched something in his face transform entirely. The violence banked, replaced by an aching tenderness that made her chest tighten painfully, as he looked, for the first time, directly at his daughter. "Hi," he said softly, his voice unrecognizable from the one he'd used on the phone 30 seconds earlier. "You must be Sophia." Sophia, entirely unbothered by the tension surrounding her, studied him with the frank curiosity of a 3-year-old. "You have my eyes," she said, which was, in fact, backward, but devastatingly accurate all the same. Something broke open in Marco's face, grief and joy so tangled together that Isabella couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. And for a moment he simply knelt there, looking at his daughter for the first time in her life, unable to speak. "Marco," Isabella's voice pulled him back. "Who was that man? Was it her? Was it Serena?" He stood, the tenderness sealing back behind his usual composure with visible effort. "I don't know yet. My men are tracing the plates now. But I need you to understand something, Isabella, and I need you to actually hear it this time, not just endure it." He stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze, close enough that the old, familiar pull between them reasserted itself despite every ounce of caution she still carried. "I'm not asking you to move in with me because I want to control your life. I'm asking because I cannot protect you and Sophia properly from a distance. And every hour that passes with the two of you in a house I don't have eyes on is an hour I cannot account for your safety. This isn't about us. This is about keeping my daughter breathing." "Your penthouse," Isabella said slowly, understanding the direction this was heading. "It's the most secure building in the city. Full security detail, controlled access, cameras on every entrance. My parents will help with your father. Vittorio already offered, before you ask, because he feels the weight of what happened to you as much as I do. You'd have your own space, Sophia would have her own room, and I would have the ability to guarantee, actually guarantee, that nothing gets within 100 feet of either of you without my knowledge." Isabella looked down at Sophia, who had already lost interest in the adult conversation and was busy examining her own shoelaces with intense concentration, and felt the impossible weight of the decision settle onto her shoulders. Everything in her that had spent 3 years building independence, building distance, building a life that owed nothing to the Caruso name, screamed against the idea of moving into Marco's penthouse like the 11 months of their engagement had simply resumed where they'd left off. But underneath that resistance was a colder, more practical fear. The black sedan, the man in sunglasses, the very real possibility that Serena Volpe's 3-year-old vendetta had just found its new target in the form of a 3-year-old girl with unmistakable Caruso eyes. "Temporary," Isabella finally said, "until you catch whoever that was, until you can actually prove Sophia and I are safe again. And I want my own space, Marco, not anything else. Just safety, for as long as it takes." "Temporary," he agreed, though something in his eyes suggested he had already privately decided he intended to make it permanent, one careful day at a time. "Whatever terms keep you safe, I'll take them." She followed his SUV back to her parents' house to collect their things, her mind racing through the implications of what she'd just agreed to, and found herself, despite every rational objection, unable to entirely suppress a small, dangerous flicker of something that felt disturbingly close to relief. The relief of no longer having to carry the weight of protecting her daughter alone. She did not yet know that the man in the black sedan had, in fact, been sent by Serena Volpe, not to harm her, not yet, but simply to confirm what Serena had suspected since the gala 3 nights earlier, that Marco Caruso's long-buried weakness had returned to the city, more valuable as a target now than she had ever been 3 years ago, because now she had given him something even more precious to lose. The penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower overlooking the harbour, and Isabella's first impression, stepping off the private elevator with Sophia asleep against her shoulder and 2 suitcases in tow, was that it looked less like a home and more like a fortress that had been very expensively disguised as one. "There's a keypad on every interior door," Marco explained, leading her through a living room with floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture in muted greys and deep blues, tasteful in a way that surprised her. She'd half expected the ostentatious excess she associated with old Mafia money, and instead found something closer to restraint, almost austerity, as if the man who lived here had deliberately stripped away anything unnecessary. "Cameras cover every hallway and entrance. The elevator won't move without a code or a fingerprint from someone on the approved list, which now includes you. No one gets onto this floor who isn't cleared, and I mean no one. Not staff, not family, not anyone, without my direct authorization." "It's beautiful," Isabella admitted, and meant it, though the compliment felt strange leaving her mouth after everything that had passed between them. "Sophia's room?" He led her down a hallway to a room that stopped her cold in the doorway. Freshly painted a soft lavender, a bed shaped like a small castle, shelves already stocked with books and toys that looked expensive and carefully chosen rather than randomly purchased. "You didn't know she existed a week ago," Isabella said quietly, staring at the room. "I had this room prepared the day I confirmed you were back in the city." Marco's voice was carefully neutral, but she caught the vulnerability underneath it. "I didn't know about Sophia yet. I just knew, I hoped that someday, if I was patient enough, if I was careful enough, you might let me back into your life in some capacity. I wanted to be ready if that day ever came. I didn't expect it to come with a daughter attached, but I promise you, Isabella, nothing about that discovery has been anything other than the best thing that's happened to me in 3 years." She didn't answer, mostly because she didn't trust her own voice, and carried Sophia into the room to settle her into the small castle bed, tucking a blanket around her daughter's small form with hands that were not entirely steady. Her own room, down a different hallway, was similarly thoughtful, not decorated the way Sophia's had been since he hadn't known she was coming, but clearly the guest suite reserved for someone he intended to be treated as more than a temporary visitor. A private bathroom, a small sitting area, a window with a view of the harbour lights beginning to flicker on as evening settled over the city. "I'll be down the hall if you need anything," Marco said from the doorway, careful to keep his distance. Careful, she noticed, to give her every possible signal that he was not going to push for anything she hadn't offered. "There's food in the kitchen if you're hungry. My housekeeper, Rosa, comes in the mornings. She's cleared. She's been with the family for 20 years. You can trust her completely." "And Isabella?" He paused, something raw crossing his face before he mastered it. "Thank you." for trusting me with this much, even temporarily. I know what it cost you to say yes." He left before she could respond, and Isabella stood alone in the guest suite of the penthouse belonging to the man who had once left her at an altar, and felt the strange, dislocating vertigo of a life that had just folded back on itself in a way she never could have predicted 3 weeks ago. Dinner that evening was quieter than she expected. Marco cooked, which surprised her, moving through the kitchen with an ease that suggested it was one of the few places he allowed himself to be entirely unguarded, and Sophia, who had woken from her nap in an unusually good mood, spent the meal peppering him with the relentless questions of a 3-year-old meeting a new and interesting adult. "Do you have a dog?" "No, but if you wanted one, I imagine we could discuss it." Marco's mouth curved into something that was almost dangerously a smile. "Mummy says dogs are a lot of work." "Mummy is usually right about things like that." He glanced at Isabella across the table, something warm and careful in his expression that made her chest ache with the complicated tangle of feelings she still hadn't sorted through. "But I have a feeling I would find a way to make it work if it made you happy." Isabella watched her daughter and the father she'd never known interact with an ease that felt both miraculous and devastating, and found herself, despite every careful boundary she'd constructed, unable to entirely suppress the ache of watching something she'd once dreamed of, a family dinner, a father who adored his daughter, a home that felt, however temporarily, like it might actually be safe, unfold in front of her after 3 years of believing it was permanently, irrevocably lost. Later, after Sophia had been put to bed and the penthouse had settled into the particular quiet of a household with a sleeping child, Isabella found herself on the private terrace off the living room, wrapped in a cardigan against the evening breeze, staring out at the harbour lights and trying to untangle the knot of everything she was feeling. Marco joined her without asking, leaning against the railing a careful distance away, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "I keep waiting to feel angry again," Isabella finally said, not looking at him. "The way I felt for 3 years. I keep expecting it to come back, and it doesn't, and I don't know what that means." "What do you feel instead?" "Confused. Grateful, which makes me angry at myself for feeling grateful, and—" She stopped, the next word catching in her throat. "And?" His voice was very quiet. "And I keep remembering what it felt like, before all of this, to be in a room with you and feel like nothing bad could ever happen as long as you were there. And I hate that some part of me still feels that after everything, standing on this terrace right now." Marco was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a rawness she'd rarely heard from him, even at his most vulnerable. "I have spent 3 years telling myself that feeling was gone, that I'd burned it down the moment I let you walk out of that cathedral alone. I built an entire life around dismantling the people who took it from us. And somewhere, in the middle of that, I stopped believing I had any right to want it back." He turned to face her fully. "I'm not going to pretend I don't still love you, Isabella. I never stopped, not for a single day of those 3 years. But I also know that loving you doesn't erase what my choice cost you. And I'm not going to ask you to forgive that just because we're standing on the same terrace again." "I don't know if I can forgive it," Isabella admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't think I hate you anymore either." and I don't know what to do with the space in between." "You don't have to know," Marco said. "Not tonight. Not for as long as you need." He didn't move closer, though every line of his body suggested how much restraint that cost him. "I'll take whatever you're able to give me, Isabella, even if that's nothing more than allowing me to keep you and Sophia safe. I meant what I said. I'm not finished until Serena Volpe can never touch either of you again. Everything else we figure out at whatever pace you need." She looked at him for a long moment in the harbour light. This man who had broken her heart to save her life, who had built a fortress around her without asking anything in return, and felt the careful architecture of her 3-year hatred crack open just a little further, wide enough to let something dangerously close to hope slip through. The name Serena Volpe had haunted the edges of Isabella's memory since the gala, a face she could barely picture beyond a vague impression of dark hair and an expensive dress at her own wedding reception. But Marco's security team assembled a full briefing within 4 days of her moving into the penthouse, and what Isabella learned reshaped everything she thought she understood about the last 3 years of her life. Serena Volpe was the only daughter of Alessandro Volpe, head of a rival organisation that had spent 2 decades locked in an uneasy détente with the Caruso family. Not open war, but a constant grinding competition for territory, contracts and influence that occasionally spilled into violence neither family ever formally acknowledged. Serena had grown up in her father's shadow, ambitious in a way the old man had never fully trusted, and when Alessandro died of natural causes 18 months earlier, Serena had seized control of the organisation with a ruthlessness that surprised even the people who thought they knew her. "She's smarter than her father ever was," Marco explained, standing at the head of a conference table in the penthouse's private office, a wall of monitors behind him, displaying surveillance photos, financial records, an intricate web of shell companies. "Alessandro wanted territory. Serena wants total elimination of any rival family that could challenge her, and she's patient enough to spend years building toward it, instead of striking impulsively. The plot against you 3 years ago wasn't rage, Isabella. It was strategy. She wanted to break my family by breaking me. And she calculated correctly that killing you at the altar would do more damage than a decade of territorial disputes." Isabella sat across the table, studying the photograph of Serena Volpe pinned to the display. An elegant woman in her mid-30s with a face that gave away nothing. The kind of composed beauty that Isabella recognized as its own form of armor. "And now she knows about Sophia." "We have to assume so." The man in the sedan was confirmed as one of hers. Low-level, deniable. The kind of surveillance she'd send if she wanted confirmation of a rumor before committing further resources. Marco's jaw tightened. "Which means she's rebuilding a plan, the same way she did 3 years ago, except this time the leverage isn't just you. It's both of you." "So what do we do?" Isabella asked, and the "we" slipped out before she'd fully decided to include herself in it. A small linguistic surrender she noticed even as Marco's eyes flickered toward her with something that looked, briefly, like relief. "We finish what I started 3 years ago," he said. "I've spent that time building a case, gathering evidence connecting Serena directly to the assassination plot at our wedding. Evidence solid enough that even the families who prefer to look away from this kind of conflict won't be able to ignore it. If I can present that evidence to the full Council of Families, the group that maintains whatever fragile peace exists between organizations like mine and hers, I can have her formally sanctioned, stripped of protection, isolated enough that she can't continue operating without consequences she can't survive. And if the council doesn't act? Marco's expression went very cold. Then I handle it myself, the way I should have 3 years ago, before I let caution cost us this much time apart. The council meeting was scheduled for the following week, an event Marco explained with visible reluctance would require his presence at a neutral location with minimal security, a vulnerability he clearly hated but couldn't avoid. The old family's tradition of settling disputes required the accused and the accuser to appear in person, unarmed, in a demonstration of the trust the entire fragile system depended on. "I don't want you anywhere near that meeting," Marco said when Isabella asked, with a directness that surprised even her, whether she could attend. "It's not a request, Isabella. Serena will be in that room. I am not putting you within 100 feet of her until she's been neutralized as a threat. I have a right to be there. She tried to kill me. And if I fail to secure the council's support, if this goes wrong, I need you and Sophia somewhere safe enough that whatever happens to me doesn't happen to you as well." His voice cracked just slightly on the admission, the first time she'd heard him acknowledge the possibility of his own failure since she'd returned to the city. "I have already lost 3 years with you and my daughter because I was trying to protect you. I am not going to lose the rest of whatever time we have left because you were standing in a room I couldn't fully secure." Isabella studied him across the conference table. This man who had spent 3 years methodically dismantling a criminal network in order to earn the right to protect a family he wasn't even certain he'd have the chance to build. And felt something in her chest shift again. Another piece of the wall she'd built cracking loose. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll stay away from the meeting. But Marco, I need you to come back from it. Sophia just found her father a week ago. I am not going to be the one who has to explain to her why he's gone again." Something in his face broke open at that. Not quite a smile, something deeper and more fragile. The expression of a man hearing for the first time in 3 years something that sounded dangerously close to a woman who might still love him, despite every reason she had not to. "I will come back," he said, and the vow in his voice carried the weight of a man who intended to keep it, even if it cost him everything he had left to give. That night, after Sophia was asleep and the penthouse had settled into its familiar quiet, Isabella found herself standing outside Marco's office, watching through the half-open door as he reviewed the evidence he'd spent 3 years assembling, his face lit by the cold glow of the monitors, his shoulders carrying the visible weight of a man about to risk everything on a single confrontation. She didn't fully understand in that moment that she had already made a decision her conscious mind hadn't caught up to yet, that somewhere between the gala and this quiet hallway she had stopped protecting herself from the possibility of loving Marco Caruso again, and started, instead, protecting the possibility itself. 2 nights before the council meeting, Marco insisted Isabella attend a fundraiser at Volo, the nightclub his family owned on the waterfront. Not out of choice, he explained with evident frustration, but because the council's protocol required a public display of confidence before any formal accusation, a demonstration that the Caruso family had nothing to hide and no reason to fear scrutiny. "It's theatre," he told her, adjusting his cufflinks in the penthouse's entryway mirror, while Isabella descended the stairs in a deep burgundy dress Rosa had helped her choose from a selection that had mysteriously appeared in her closet that afternoon, a gesture from Marco she'd decided, after some internal debate, to accept as thoughtfulness rather than presumption. Every family that matters will be there. Serena will be there. I need to walk into that room looking like a man with nothing to hide and everything to lose. And I need you beside me to make that performance convincing. You could have just told me you wanted a date, Isabella said, and was surprised by her own lightness, a flicker of the woman she used to be before a cathedral and an envelope of cash had reshaped her into someone more guarded. Marco's eyes met hers in the mirror, something warm cutting through the tension he'd been carrying all week. I would have asked if I thought for a second you'd have said yes to something that simple. Volu occupied a converted warehouse on the waterfront, all exposed brick and dramatic lighting, the kind of space that managed to feel both intimate and impossibly grand at once. Isabella had heard of it before. Everyone in the city had, but she'd never set foot inside, and stepping through the door on Marco's arm, feeling the weight of 100 curious stares settle onto her the moment they were recognized, she understood immediately why he'd called it theatre. "There she is," a voice murmured behind them as they moved deeper into the club, not quite quiet enough to be accidental. The runaway bride. Didn't think she'd have the nerve to show her face again. Isabella's spine stiffened, old humiliation flaring hot and immediate, but Marco's hand found the small of her back, steady and grounding. "Ignore them," he murmured against her ear. "They're small people who need to feel large by making others feel small. You are the only person in this room who actually knows the truth of what happened 3 years ago, and that makes you the only person whose opinion matters." They found a private booth on the club's upper level, overlooking the main floor, and Isabella watched Marco transform in real time into the version of himself the city expected: cold, commanding, utterly controlled, greeting rival family heads with handshakes that looked friendly and calculations that clearly weren't. She understood, watching him move through that performance, exactly how much it cost him, the muscle in his jaw that never fully relaxed, the way his eyes tracked every exit and entrance with the vigilance of a man who had learned, the hardest possible way, what happened when he let his guard down for even a moment. It was nearly an hour into the evening when Serena Volpe arrived. Isabella recognized her instantly from the briefing photographs, though nothing in those photographs had captured the particular quality of her presence in person. A woman who moved through a room like she already owned it, dressed in black that made every other guest's finery look try-hard by comparison. A composed, faintly amused smile that never quite reached her eyes. She made her way directly to their booth, unhurried, unbothered by the visible tension her arrival sent rippling through the room. "Marco." Her voice was low, cultured, carrying the particular warmth people use when they want an audience to believe two enemies are actually old friends. "And Isabella. What a surprise, seeing you back in the city. I do hope the last 3 years have been kind to you, given the circumstances." "Serena." Isabella's own voice surprised her with its steadiness. 3 years of building a career, of learning to hold her ground in rooms full of powerful people who underestimated her, finally paying off in the moment she needed it most. "I hear you've been busy since your father passed, building quite a reputation for yourself." Something flickered behind Serena's composed mask. Surprise, quickly smoothed over at the unexpected sharpness of the response. "One does what's necessary to protect one's interests. I imagine you understand that better than most, Isabella, given how thoroughly you've rebuilt your own life. A career, I hear. A child." Her eyes flicked deliberately toward Marco, the implication landing with surgical precision. "How resourceful of you." "Careful," Marco said, his voice dropping into a register Isabella had never heard him use, cold enough that the temperature at the table seemed to drop several degrees. "Whatever business you have with me, Serena, it stops at the mention of my daughter. That is not a line you want to test." "Your daughter?" Serena's smile widened, sharp and satisfied, and Isabella understood, with a cold plunge of dread, that she had just confirmed something Serena had only suspected, that Sophia's paternity, whispered about but unverified, had just become established fact, delivered by Marco's own mouth, in front of a room full of witnesses whose loyalties couldn't be trusted. "How lovely for you both. Family is so important, isn't it? I do hope you're taking every precaution to keep her safe. This city can be so unpredictable." She left before Marco could respond, moving back into the crowd with the same unhurried confidence she'd arrived with, and Isabella watched her go, with her heart hammering against her ribs, understanding with sudden, sickening clarity that whatever careful advantage they'd hoped to hold going into the council meeting had just evaporated in a single, weaponized sentence. "She knew," Isabella said quietly, once Serena was out of earshot. "She already knew about Sophia. She just wanted you to confirm it." Marco's face had gone pale beneath its usual controlled composure. The first genuine fear Isabella had seen from him since she'd returned to the city. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice tight with self-recrimination. "I let her provoke me into confirming exactly what she wanted confirmed. What does that mean for the council meeting? It means she'll walk into that room in 2 days, already prepared to use Sophia as leverage, one way or another." Marco's hand found Isabella's under the table, gripping it with an intensity that spoke of fear he wasn't allowing his face to show. "We need to move up our security protocols, tonight. I'm not waiting for the council meeting to increase protection on both of you. I should have done it the moment we knew Serena had confirmed you were back in the city." They left the club within the hour. Marco's calm composure fractured just enough at the edges for Isabella to see, for the first time, exactly how much fear lived beneath his controlled exterior. Not fear for himself, she understood, as they rode home in tense silence, but fear of losing the family he'd only just begun to be allowed back into. The attack came at 2:47 in the morning, a detail Isabella would remember with the strange, hyper-specific clarity that trauma sometimes imprints, because she was awake when it happened, sitting up in bed unable to sleep, replaying Serena Volpe's smile in her mind, when the first gunshot shattered the quiet of the penthouse. She was out of bed and into Sophia's room before conscious thought caught up with instinct, scooping her sleeping daughter into her arms as a second shot rang out, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of shouting in the hallway, and Marco's voice, sharp and commanding, barking orders to his security team. "Isabella!" He appeared in the doorway seconds later, gun in hand, a wildness in his eyes she'd never seen before, the controlled composure entirely stripped away. "Panic room, now! Go, go, go!" He herded her and Sophia, awake now, crying, terrified, in the way only a 3-year-old ripped from sleep by chaos can be. Down the hallway to a reinforced door, disguised as a linen closet, keying in a code with fingers that weren't quite steady, pushing them inside a small, fortified room Isabella hadn't known existed until that exact moment. "Stay here. Don't open this door for anyone but me, and I mean anyone. Not Rosa, not my father, no one, until I come get you myself." His hands cupped her face for one desperate second, his forehead pressed briefly to hers. I love you. I have always loved you. Whatever happens out there, I need you to know that. Marco. Lock the door behind me. He was gone before she could finish, the reinforced door sealing shut with a heavy metallic click that left Isabella alone in a small fortified room with her sobbing daughter, listening to muffled gunfire echo through the walls of a building she'd believed 12 hours earlier was the safest place in the city. She didn't know how long she sat there. Sophia clutched against her chest, both of them shaking, listening to sounds she couldn't fully interpret through the reinforced walls. Shouts, more gunfire, something that might have been a struggle, and then, eventually, a silence that felt somehow more terrifying than the noise had been. The knock, when it finally came, was 3 sharp raps, followed by a pause and 2 more. A pattern Marco had told her in the panic room's hurried instructions would be the only signal she should trust. Isabella opened the door with hands that wouldn't stop shaking and found Marco standing in the hallway, blood on his shirt that she prayed to God wasn't his security chief beside him with a face like carved stone. Are you hurt? She asked, the words tumbling out before she'd fully processed the scene. It's not mine. Marco's voice was rough, exhausted in a way that went beyond the physical. 2 of Serena's men got past the outer perimeter. We stopped them before they reached you, but... He stopped, something breaking behind his controlled exterior. Isabella, I need you to understand what almost happened tonight. I need you to understand that this isn't a threat I can promise to fully contain. Not while she's still operating freely, not while the council hasn't formally acted. Isabella looked past him, down the hallway, to where 2 bodies lay covered by sheets near the shattered remains of a window, and felt the full weight of the danger she and her daughter had walked into finally land with its true force. They were coming for Sophia, she said, understanding arriving in a cold, clarifying rush. Not me, not you, her. I don't know that for certain. Marco's jaw was tight, but something in his eyes told her he suspected the same thing she did. But I'm not willing to wait and find out. This ends at the council meeting, Isabella. Tomorrow, I am not giving Serena Volpe another 24 hours to plan a second attempt. The following morning arrived grey and heavy, the penthouse still carrying the acrid ghost scent of gunpowder, despite the security team's overnight cleanup. And Isabella sat with Sophia in the kitchen, forcing herself to eat breakfast for her daughter's sake, while every instinct in her body screamed to flee the city entirely, take Sophia somewhere Serena Volpe could never find them. I thought about it, she admitted to Marco when he found her there, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept at all. Running. Taking Sophia somewhere far away from all of this, the way I did 3 years ago. And? His voice was careful, bracing for an answer he clearly feared. And I realized running didn't actually protect me 3 years ago. It just delayed the reckoning. Isabella looked up at him, something resolved settling into her expression that hadn't been there the night before. You spent 3 years building a case against her. I want to see it finished, not because I trust that everything will be fine. I don't, not after last night. But because I am done letting Serena Volpe determine the shape of my life from a distance. If she wants a fight, she can have one. But it ends today, one way or another. Marco studied her for a long moment, something fierce and proud moving behind his exhausted eyes. You sound like a woman who spent 3 years learning she doesn't need anyone's protection to be formidable. I learned that a long time before I met you, Isabella said, and meant it, though the words carried none of the old bitterness they might have 3 weeks earlier. But I'm learning something else now, too, that accepting help doesn't make me weak. It just means I finally have people worth trusting with the parts of my life I can't carry alone. She reached across the table and took his hand, the first time she had initiated the contact since her return to the city, and watched something in Marco Caruso's face rebuild itself, piece by piece, into a version of hope he had clearly not allowed himself to feel in 3 long years. The council meeting is at 4 this afternoon, he said quietly. I need to go alone. But Isabella, when it's over, whatever happens, I want you and Sophia there with me, not in the room, but close enough that the first thing I see walking out of it is the two of you waiting for me.
We'll be there, she promised, and understood, saying the words, that she had crossed some final threshold in her own heart. Not full forgiveness, not yet, but something adjacent to it, something built on the terrifying, exhilarating recognition that she wanted a future with this man badly enough to fight for it. The council convened at a private estate an hour outside the city, a sprawling old villa that had hosted these particular negotiations for 3 generations, neutral ground maintained by an aging patriarch named Ferraro, whose family had long ago stepped back from active business in favour of serving as the arbiter for exactly this kind of dispute. Marco arrived alone, as protocol demanded, dressed in the same understated dark suit he'd worn to the restaurant meeting with Isabella weeks earlier, carrying a single briefcase containing 3 years of meticulously gathered evidence, financial trails, recorded confessions from 2 men who'd once worked for Serena and had since been persuaded, through methods Marco declined to fully explain even to Isabella, to cooperate with his investigation, and a chain of documentation connecting every thread back to a single, undeniable source. The council chamber held 11 heads of families arranged around a long table, Don Vittorio Caruso seated among them with the grim, watchful stillness of a father who understood exactly how much rode on the next hour, and Serena Volpe seated directly across the table, composed and elegant in charcoal grey, betraying no outward sign of the desperation Marco suspected was building beneath her calm exterior after last night's failed attack. You called this council, old Ferraro said, his voice carrying the particular authority of a man who had presided over these proceedings for 30 years, to bring formal accusation against Serena Volpe. The council recognizes the gravity of that request. Speak your evidence, Marco Caruso, and know that this body does not act on accusation alone. Marco stood, and Isabella, had she been in that room instead of waiting 3 miles away in a car with Sophia and 2 of Marco's most trusted guards, would have recognized the particular calm that settled over him. The same calm she'd watched him wear during the 11 months of their engagement. The composure of a man who had spent his entire life learning to be dangerous without ever raising his voice. 3 years ago, 9 days before my wedding, I received credible intelligence that Serena Volpe had contracted a professional shooter to assassinate my bride, Isabella Moretti, during our wedding ceremony. He opened the briefcase, laying documents across the table with deliberate precision. I verified that intelligence through 3 independent sources before acting. I have since spent 3 years gathering additional evidence, including direct testimony from 2 men
previously in Serena Volpe's employ. Financial records tracing a payment of $200,000 through 4 shell companies to the contracted shooter. And communications intercepted 18 months ago confirming Serena Volpe's intent to finish what she started, should the opportunity arise.
He looked directly at Serena as he continued. That opportunity arose 2 nights ago, when 2 of her men breached my residence and attempted to reach my daughter, a 3-year-old child whose only crime is existing as proof that Isabella Moretti survived what Serena Volpe intended 3 years ago. A murmur moved through the assembled family heads. The particular ripple of a room absorbing information that would reshape long-standing alliances. "This is fabrication," Serena said, her voice steady, though Isabella would later learn from Marco that a slight tremor in her hands, visible only to those seated close enough to notice, betrayed the crack beneath her composure. Marco Caruso abandoned his own bride at the altar 3 years ago, a humiliation this entire city witnessed. Now he wants this council to believe it was some elaborate rescue, conveniently unprovable, conveniently timed to coincide with his sudden reunion with a woman who could easily be manipulated into corroborating whatever story protects his reputation. "The men who breached his residence 2 nights ago are dead," Ferraro said, his voice carrying a warning edge. "Killed by Caruso security in the act of attempted intrusion. Do you deny employing them, Serena Volpe?" "I deny nothing that hasn't been proven," Serena said carefully. "I question the timing of this entire narrative." It was Don Vittorio who spoke next, his voice carrying the weight of a father who had watched his son disappear for 3 years without explanation, who had carried the burden of that silence within his own household. "I can confirm my son came to me 9 days before his wedding, visibly shaken, requesting resources to verify a threat he refused to explain in detail, out of fear that any leak, even within our own family, could compromise the operation to protect his bride. I did not learn the full truth until recently, but I can confirm the timeline he describes, independent of anything he has said today. The evidence, laid out piece by piece over the following 40 minutes, built a case even the most skeptical council members found difficult to dismiss. Financial trails too specific to fabricate, testimony from men with nothing left to gain by lying, a pattern of behavior stretching back 3 years that painted a portrait of calculated, patient ruthlessness entirely consistent with everything the assembled families already privately believed about Serena Volpe's ambitions. When Ferraro finally called the vote, whether to formally sanction Serena Volpe, stripping her of the protections and alliances that had allowed her organization to operate freely, effectively isolating her among the city's power structures, the result was not close. 8 of 11 families voted in favor, more than enough to constitute the formal, binding condemnation the old system required. Serena Volpe sat very still as the verdict was read, her composure finally, visibly cracking at the edges, something cold and furious moving behind her eyes that made even the hardened men around that table shift uncomfortably in their seats. "You've made a mistake," she said quietly, standing, addressing the room with a voice that had lost none of its danger despite the loss of formal protection. "All of you. You think sanctioning me ends this. It doesn't. I built an organization my father never had the vision to build, and I am not going to watch it dismantled because Marco Caruso finally found the evidence he spent 3 years assembling." Her eyes found Marco's, cold and absolute. "This isn't over. Whatever protection this council has stripped from me today,
I will make certain you understand exactly what it cost you to take it." She left the chamber without waiting for a response, and Ferraro's voice, tired and grave, closed the session with a warning that Isabella would later learn had chilled even the most experienced men in that room. The council has ruled, but make no mistake, a woman who has just lost everything she built has very little left to lose in retaliation. Marco Caruso, I would advise extreme caution in the days ahead. Marco left the estate with the formal ruling secured, 3 years of methodical work finally, officially validated by the only authority in the city's underworld capable of granting it. But as he walked to his car, the weight of Serena's parting words sat heavier in his chest than the victory should have allowed, a warning he intended to take with the deadly seriousness it deserved. Isabella was waiting exactly where she'd promised, standing beside the car with Sophia's hand in hers, and the moment she saw Marco emerge from the estate's front entrance, uninjured, walking with the particular loose-shouldered relief of a man who had just survived something enormous, she felt 3 years of accumulated tension finally, fully release from her chest.
"It's done," he said, reaching them, and for the first time since she'd known him, even during their engagement, even at his most openly affectionate, he pulled her into an embrace with no calculation, no careful restraint, just the pure, uncomplicated relief of a man who had feared he might not survive to have this moment. The council sanctioned her, formally. She's lost her protections, her alliances, everything her father built for her to inherit. "Is it over?" Isabella asked, though something in his expression, even amid the relief, told her the answer wasn't simple. The formal threat is contained, but she made it clear before she left that she doesn't consider this finished. His arms tightened around her, Sophia sandwiched happily between them, oblivious to the gravity of the conversation happening above her head. "I'm not going to lie to you about that, Isabella. I've spent 3 years underestimating what she's capable of, and I'm not going to make that mistake again. We stay careful, we stay protected, but today is a victory I've been fighting for since before I even knew Sophia existed, and I don't want to let Serena's threats steal it from us entirely." That evening, back at the penthouse with security doubled and every entrance monitored with renewed vigilance, something in the household's atmosphere shifted into a fragile, cautious celebration. Rosa prepared an elaborate dinner without being asked. Don Vittorio and Adriana Caruso arrived, Isabella's first meeting with Marco's mother since the wedding that never happened, a reunion that began stiffly and ended unexpectedly, with Adriana weeping quietly over Sophia's sleeping form and thanking Isabella again and again for the granddaughter she'd never expected to have the chance to know. "I am sorry," Adriana said to Isabella later, the two women alone on the terrace while the men discussed security logistics inside. "For every day of those 3 years that you believed my son had abandoned you without cause. I knew nothing. Marco protected even his own mother from the truth, to keep all of us safe from what we didn't know. But I should have reached out to you regardless. A woman humiliated in front of the entire city deserved at least the comfort of another woman who suspected there might be more to the story than anyone was saying." "You couldn't have known," Isabella said, surprised by how easily forgiveness came for this particular wound, when so many others still sat raw and unresolved. "None of us could have. I spent 3 years hating a man who was trying to save my life. I think I understand, better than most people could, how completely a lie built out of love
can still feel indistinguishable from betrayal. And now? Adriana asked, studying her with the same searching intensity Isabella remembered from their first meeting years earlier. What do you feel now? Isabella looked through the terrace doors to where Marco stood in quiet conversation with his father, his posture relaxed in a way she hadn't seen since her return to the city, occasionally glancing toward the terrace as if he couldn't quite stop himself from checking that she was still there. I feel like I'm standing at the edge of deciding whether to let myself love him again, she admitted, the confession surprising her even as she said it. And I feel terrified, because the last time I let myself feel that completely, it cost me 3 years of grief I'm still not sure I've fully processed. Love that costs nothing isn't usually love worth having, Adriana said, with the particular wisdom of a woman who had spent 40 years married to a man whose business required exactly this kind of impossible calculus. I watched my son disappear for 3 years rather than risk your life for his own comfort. Whatever else you decide, Isabella, know that the love driving that choice was never in question. Only the wisdom of how he chose to protect it. Later that night, after the elder Carusos had left and Sophia had been tucked into her small castle bed, Isabella found herself back on the terrace, the same spot where she and Marco had stood weeks earlier on her first night in the penthouse. The harbour lights spread out below them in their familiar glittering pattern. Marco joined her there without a word, standing close enough this time that their shoulders nearly touched. And for a long moment they simply stood together in silence, two people who had survived an enormous amount to arrive at this particular quiet evening. Today, when I thought I might not come back from that council meeting, he finally said, the only thing I could think about was that I still hadn't told you everything I needed to say. 3 years of things I rehearsed in my head so many times, and in the moment I thought might be my last chance, all I could remember was your face. Tell me now, Isabella said quietly. He turned to face her fully, his expression stripped of every careful defense she'd watched him maintain for weeks. I have loved you since the first night we met, at your cousin's engagement party, when you told off a man 3 times your size for making a joke at another woman's expense, and then apologized to me for ruining the mood, as if standing up for someone was something that required an apology. I loved you through 11 months of pretending our engagement was simple, when I already knew, by month 3, that the danger surrounding my family would eventually threaten you. I loved you enough to destroy my own reputation, to let you believe the worst possible version of me, because the alternative was risking a world without you in it at all. And I have loved you every single day of the 3 years I spent hunting down every thread of the plot that took you from me. Because loving you was the only thing that made those 3 years survivable. Isabella's eyes had filled with tears she made no effort to hide. 3 years of carefully guarded grief finally finding its release in the quiet honesty of his voice. Marco. I'm not asking you to say it back, he continued, though the hope in his eyes betrayed how badly he wanted her to. I know I have to earn that, properly, the way I never got the chance to before. But I needed you to know, completely, without any doubt left between us, exactly how much you and Sophia mean to me. Whatever happens next with Serena, whatever it takes to keep the two of you safe for the rest of your lives, I am not going anywhere again, Isabella. Not without you knowing exactly why, and not without your permission. Isabella closed the small remaining distance between them, reaching up to cup his face in both hands, the same gesture he'd once used on her the night before their wedding, and felt something in her chest finally, fully unlock. "I love you too," she whispered, the words arriving easier than she expected, 3 years of grief transforming in this single moment into something that finally felt like healing instead of loss. "I never stopped, even when I hated you for it. I just needed to understand the truth before I could let myself feel it again without being afraid." Marco kissed her then, gently at first, and then, with 3 years of restrained longing finally breaking free, and Isabella let herself fall into it completely, understanding, for the first time since a cathedral full of white lilies and an envelope of cash had shattered her life apart, that some loves survive even their own destruction, if the people carrying them are patient and brave enough to rebuild what was broken. The weeks that followed carried a quality Isabella hadn't experienced in over 3 years. Something dangerously close to peace. Serena Volpe, stripped of her council protections and isolated from the alliance network that had once amplified her reach, went quiet in a way that Marco's security team monitored with careful skepticism, but couldn't immediately interpret as either retreat or regrouping. Isabella used the unexpected calm to do something she hadn't allowed herself to consider seriously since arriving back in the city. Imagine a future. She spent an afternoon on a video call with her New York business partner, discussing the logistics of expanding Isabella Moretti events into a second city. A conversation that had started as idle speculation and ended with her staring at a lease agreement for commercial space 3 blocks from the harbour, close enough to the penthouse that the practical shape of a life built in this city, rather than merely visiting it, had started to feel less like fantasy and more like planning. "You're thinking about staying?" Marco observed one evening, finding her at the kitchen island surrounded by spreadsheets and paint swatches for a potential office space. Sophia asleep upstairs after a full day that had included her first real conversation with her grandfather Salvatore, now fully recovered and utterly besotted with his granddaughter. "I'm thinking about it," Isabella admitted, not looking up from her laptop. "My business can operate from anywhere with a decent internet connection and a good team, which I've spent 3 years building in New York. But Sophia has grandparents here who adore her. She has a father here who spent 3 weeks trying to make up for 3 years he can't get back. And I have—" She paused, finally looking up at him. "I have you, apparently, whatever that means, long term." "It means whatever you want it to mean," Marco said carefully, though the hope in his voice was impossible to fully disguise. "I'm not going to pretend I don't want you to stay, Isabella. I want a life with you and Sophia more than I've wanted anything in 3 years of wanting very little beyond that. But I also know I have no right to ask you to uproot a life you built entirely without me, especially not while Serena Volpe remains an unresolved threat." "That's the part that scares me," Isabella admitted. "Not the moving, not even the relationship, though God knows that's its own complicated thing to navigate. It's the not knowing whether this peace is real or just the calm before she regroups and tries again." Marco's expressions sobered, the careful optimism of the previous weeks tempering into the vigilance that had defined most of his adult life. "I won't lie to you and tell you the threat is fully neutralized. My people are tracking her movements as closely as they can, without direct confrontation, but she's gone quiet in a way that concerns me more than open aggression would. Serena doesn't retreat when she loses, she recalculates. That recalculation, they would learn 3 days later, had already been well underway. The first sign came from an unlikely source, Isabella's own business, 3,000 miles away in New York, where her hostess-turned-office manager called in a panic to report that their office space had been broken into overnight. Files rifled through, client records copied from an unsecured backup drive Isabella had forgotten still contained personal information, including, buried in an old intake form from 3 years earlier, the address of the Astoria apartment she'd lived in during her pregnancy.
"It's not a robbery," Marco said grimly, reviewing the security footage his New York contacts had obtained within hours of the break-in. "Nothing of value was taken. This was reconnaissance. Someone wanted information about your life before you returned here. Your patterns, your history, anything that could be used as leverage or as a way to locate you if you ever left the protection of this penthouse again."
Serena.
"I'd stake my life on it." His jaw tightened with the particular fury Isabella had learned to recognize as fear disguised as anger. "She's not planning a direct attack, not yet. She's building a contingency, a way to reach you if the direct approach continues to fail. Which means we need to assume she's also watching for any opportunity where our security might lapse, any moment we let our guard down because the immediate threat feels contained." Isabella felt the fragile peace of the last 3 weeks crack under the weight of this new information. Old fear resurfacing with a familiar, unwelcome intensity. How long does this go on, Marco? How many years do Sophia and I spend looking over our shoulders because a woman who lost a council vote refuses to accept defeat? Until I make certain she physically cannot threaten either of you again. Marco's voice carried an absolute finality that sent a chill through Isabella, despite the warmth of the kitchen around them. I know what that sounds like. I know what it means coming from someone in my position. But I have spent 3 years trying to solve this problem through legitimate channels. The council, evidence, formal sanction, and it has slowed her down without stopping her. I am not willing to gamble my daughter's safety on the hope that a woman this determined simply gives up because the rules say she should. Isabella didn't ask him to clarify exactly what making certain would ultimately require. Some part of her, the part that had grown up in a world adjacent to exactly this kind of power, even before she'd fallen in love with a Mafia heir, understood implicitly the weight of what he was describing, and understood, with a complicated tangle of fear and something that felt uncomfortably close to acceptance, that she was not going to stand in the way of whatever he believed necessary to keep their daughter alive. "Just come back to us," she said instead, echoing the words she'd said before the council meeting, words that had already carried them through one crisis and that she hoped desperately would carry them through whatever came next. "Whatever you have to do, just come back." The break came 10 days later, delivered not through Marco's extensive network of informants, but through an unexpected phone call to Isabella's personal cell phone, a number she had shared with almost no one since returning to the city. "Isabella Moretti?" The voice was unmistakable, cultured and cold, and Isabella's hand tightened around the phone hard enough to whiten her knuckles. "I do hope I'm not interrupting anything important. How did you get this number?" Isabella kept her voice level, with an effort that cost her considerably, moving instinctively toward the room where Sophia was playing, a mother's reflex to place herself between her child and any perceived threat, even one arriving through a phone line. "I have my ways, darling. I've always found information more useful than violence, though I understand your Marco prefers the more direct approach." Serena's voice carried a lightness that made the threat underneath it more chilling, not less. "I'm calling to propose a meeting, just the two of us. No security,
No Marco hovering with his gun and his righteous fury. Woman to woman. I think we have more in common than either of us would like to admit, and I believe you deserve to hear the full truth about your fiancé from someone who isn't invested in protecting his reputation. I know the truth already. Do you? Something sharpened in Serena's voice. Do you know, for instance, that Marco Caruso killed my father? Not directly. Alessandro's heart simply failed him, the doctors said. Natural causes, nothing suspicious.
Except my father had been in perfect health for 71 years, until 6 months after Marco began systematically destroying every business relationship, every alliance, every source of income my family depended on. Stress kills, Isabella. Slowly, quietly, in ways that never show up on an autopsy report. Marco Caruso murdered my father just as surely as if he'd pulled a trigger. And he did it because eliminating my family's power was the only way he could guarantee eliminating the threat to you. Isabella's stomach turned cold, though she forced her voice to remain steady. If that's true, it doesn't change anything about what you tried to do to me. You planned to kill me at my own wedding. And you think that plan emerged from nothing? Serena's laugh was sharp, humorless. My father spent decades building an uneasy peace with the Carusos, a balance of power that kept both our families profitable without open war. Marco's engagement to you was meant to be a symbol of continued peace between old rival houses. Did you know that? Your marriage was never simply a love story, Isabella, however much you wanted to believe it was. It was a political alliance my father had quietly negotiated with Vittorio Caruso, one that would have cemented Caruso dominance over territory my family had controlled for 2 generations. I discovered that negotiation 4 months before your wedding, and I made a choice. A ruthless choice, I'll grant you, but not an irrational one. To eliminate the threat to my family's future before that alliance could be finalized. You're telling me I was a pawn in a territorial war I never knew existed? I'm telling you that everyone in this world is a pawn in something larger than themselves, Isabella, whether they know it or not. The only difference between you and me is that I learned that lesson early enough to fight back, and you learned it standing alone at an altar, discarded by a man who valued his family's strategy over honesty with the woman he claimed to love. Serena's voice sharpened further, urgent now beneath its cultivated calm. I am offering you the truth, and I am offering you a choice most women in your position never get. Meet me, alone. Let me show you evidence of exactly what Marco Caruso is capable of, exactly what your relationship with him has always actually been about. And then decide for yourself whether the man you've apparently forgiven deserves that forgiveness. Every instinct honed by 3 years of careful survival screamed at Isabella not to trust a single word from a woman who had tried to have her murdered. And yet beneath that instinct sat a colder, more analytical awareness. The recognition that if she refused this meeting, Serena would simply escalate, and that a controlled, deliberate confrontation on Isabella's own terms might offer information or opportunity that waiting passively for the next attack never could. Where? Isabella finally said, and felt the weight of the decision settle onto her shoulders like a physical thing. The Old Pier Warehouse, South Harbour, tonight, 10 o'clock. Alone, Isabella, or I walk away and you spend the rest of your life wondering what I might have shown you, while also wondering when I'll try again. Serena's voice carried a final, satisfied edge. I do hope you'll come. I think you'll find the truth considerably more interesting than the fairy tale you've apparently decided to believe instead. The line went dead, and Isabella stood in the penthouse hallway with her heart pounding,
staring at Sophia through the doorway of the playroom, understanding that she had just made a decision that would either end the threat against her daughter permanently or walk her directly into the trap Serena Volpe had been patiently constructing since the moment she'd learned Isabella had returned to the city. She did not tell Marco, not yet. Some cold, calculating part of her, the same part that had built a successful career from nothing, that had survived public humiliation and single motherhood and a return to a city that had once watched her fall, understood that if she told him, he would either forbid her from going or insist on accompanying her in a way that would violate the one condition that might actually draw out useful information. Instead, she called the one person whose loyalty she was certain of beyond any doubt, and whose particular skill set, 20 years in her father's restaurant business, a lifetime of quiet observation, an old friendship with a retired detective who owed him a favor, might provide the kind of discreet backup that wouldn't spook Serena into abandoning the meeting altogether. "Papa," she said, when Salvatore answered, "I need your help with something, and I need you not to tell Marco until it's already happening." The South Harbour warehouse district had been abandoned for over a decade, rows of corrugated steel buildings sitting empty since the shipping company that once used them relocated to a more modern facility across the bay, leaving behind a landscape of rusted infrastructure and shadowed alleys that Isabella navigated with her heart hammering against her ribs, and her father's old detective friend, a weathered man named Frank Delacroix, trailing 30 yards behind at her insistence, close enough to intervene, far enough to remain unseen from a distance. She had told Marco she needed air, a lie so thin she'd hated herself for using it, and had left the penthouse through a service entrance she'd learned about during a security briefing weeks earlier, aware that every minute of this deception increased the danger, not only to herself, but to the fragile trust she and Marco had spent the last month rebuilding. Serena was waiting inside the third warehouse, standing alone beneath a single work light rigged to a portable generator. And for a moment, seeing her standing there in the same composed elegance she'd worn to the nightclub weeks earlier, Isabella almost believed this might genuinely be the conversation Serena had promised. "You came alone," Serena said, and something in her voice carried genuine surprise. "I confess, I didn't expect that. Marco Caruso doesn't strike me as a man who lets the women he loves walk into danger unaccompanied." "He doesn't know I'm here." Isabella kept her distance, 20 feet of empty warehouse floor between them, every sense alert to exits, to shadows, to the particular silence of a space that felt, despite Serena's apparent solitude, far too carefully arranged to be entirely unguarded. "What evidence did you want to show me?" Serena's expression shifted, something calculating replacing the earlier surprise. "The evidence was never really the point, Isabella. I needed you here, away from his security, away from his protection, and I needed you to come willingly enough that no one could claim I'd forced your hand. Consider it a formality. The counsel I so thoroughly failed to convince requires certain proprieties be observed, even in matters of ultimate consequence." The cold dread that had been building in Isabella's chest since the phone call finally crystallized into full, immediate fear. "You're not here to talk." "I'm here to finish what I started 3 years ago." Serena's hand moved, unhurried, toward the small pistol Isabella now noticed tucked at her hip, previously hidden by the drape of her coat. "Marco took everything from me, Isabella. My father's life, indirectly but undeniably. My family's territory, systematically dismantled over 3 years of patient, ruthless work. My protection under the council, stripped away in a single afternoon of testimony and documentation he spent years assembling. I have very little left to lose, and I have decided that whatever happens to me next, I am not leaving this world without taking something from him in return. Something that will hurt him the way he's hurt me. Killing me won't bring your father back. No, but it will make certain Marco Caruso spends the rest of his life understanding exactly what it feels like to lose the thing he loves most, the way I have. Serena's hand closed fully around the pistol grip, and Isabella's entire body went cold with the certainty that whatever chance she'd taken coming here alone had just proven to be a catastrophic miscalculation. The warehouse door crashed open before Serena could raise the weapon, Frank Delacroix's voice cutting through the tense silence with the flat authority of 30 years of law enforcement experience. "Police! Weapon down! Now!" Serena's composure fractured for the first time, her eyes darting between Isabella and the unexpected intrusion, and in the half-second of her distraction, Isabella did the only thing her survival instinct allowed. She threw herself sideways behind a rusted shipping container as the first gunshot cracked through the warehouse, deafening in the enclosed space. What followed was a chaos of shouting and gunfire that Isabella would only piece together afterward in fragments. Frank Delacroix returning fire from behind a support column, more men flooding into the warehouse through the same entrance she'd used. Men she would learn belonged to Serena's remaining loyal enforcers, called in as backup the moment their employer's meeting had been compromised. She pressed herself against the cold metal of the shipping container, hands over her head, praying with a desperate, wordless intensity that she would survive to see her daughter again, that she hadn't just orphaned Sophia through her own reckless decision to face this threat alone. It was Marco's voice, cutting through the chaos moments later, that told her the tide of the confrontation had shifted. He tracked her, she would learn. Rosa had noticed her absence within 20 minutes and alerted him immediately, and a security team member had flagged the unusual route she'd taken through the service entrance, enough of a trail for Marco's people to trace her location before the situation could fully escalate beyond recovery. "Isabella!" His voice carried a desperation she'd never heard from him, not even during the council meeting, not even during the attack on the penthouse. "Isabella, where are you?" "Here," she called back, her voice cracking, relief and terror tangled together as she heard his footsteps closing the distance, heard the sounds of the warehouse chaos beginning to resolve into something more controlled, more contained, as more of his security team flooded the space. He found her behind the shipping container seconds later, dropping to his knees beside her, hands running over her body with frantic urgency, checking for injuries with the desperate thoroughness of a man who had genuinely believed, for several unbearable minutes, that he might have lost her permanently. "I'm okay," Isabella managed, though her voice shook badly enough to undermine the claim. "Marco, I'm okay. But Serena..." "My men have her." His voice was rough, raw with an adrenaline that hadn't yet fully burned off. "Isabella, why? Why would you come here alone? Why would you not tell me?" "Because I thought I could handle it. Because I needed to know the truth about what she was claiming about you, and I thought..." Isabella's composure finally broke, 3 years of carefully managed control fracturing under the weight of what she'd just survived. "I thought I could protect myself. I thought I could protect us. And I almost got myself killed instead. And I am so sorry, Marco. I am so sorry." He pulled her into his arms with a fierceness that stole the breath from her lungs, holding her against his chest, as if he could physically absorb the trauma of the last 20 minutes through sheer proximity. "Don't you ever do that again," he said, his voice breaking on every word. "Don't you ever walk into danger without telling me, without letting me stand beside you. I cannot lose you, Isabella. I survived 3 years without you because I believed it was the price of keeping you alive. I am not capable of surviving losing you a second time. Not now, not after finally getting you back. Across the warehouse, Serena Volpe stood surrounded by Caruso security. Disarmed, her carefully constructed composure entirely shattered, screaming threats that no longer carried any weight beyond the impotent fury of a woman who had gambled everything on a single desperate confrontation and lost. The days following the warehouse confrontation moved through Isabella in a strange, disjointed blur. Police statements coordinated carefully through channels Marco's family maintained precisely for situations like this one. A hospital visit for a minor cut on her arm she hadn't even noticed sustaining during her scramble behind the shipping container, and long, difficult conversations with Marco that alternated between relief so profound it felt physically overwhelming, and arguments sharp enough to leave both of them raw. "You have to understand why I couldn't tell you," Isabella said, 3 days after the warehouse, sitting across from Marco in the penthouse's private office, the same room where she'd first learned the full scope of Serena's history weeks earlier. For 3 years, I built a life where I made every decision alone. I didn't ask permission. I didn't wait for anyone's protection. And when Serena called, some part of me needed to prove, to myself maybe more than to you, that I could still handle a threat without waiting for you to fix it for me. "I understand the impulse," Marco said, his voice carefully controlled in the way she now recognized meant he was working very hard to contain something more volatile underneath. "I do, Isabella, but you have to understand what those 20 minutes cost me. I have spent 3 years living with the guilt of one impossible choice: sacrificing our relationship to save your life. And for 20 minutes in that warehouse, I believed I had lost you anyway, that every sacrifice of the last 3 years had been for nothing, because you walked into danger I couldn't protect you from, and I couldn't get to you in time." "I know." Isabella reached across the desk, taking his hand, feeling the tension still coiled tight through his fingers. "I know, and I am not going to pretend what I did wasn't reckless. But Marco, I need you to understand something too. I cannot build a life with you where every decision about my own safety gets made for me, where I'm expected to simply trust and wait and be protected without having any agency in how that protection unfolds. That's not partnership. That's just a different kind of cage, however well-intentioned." Marco was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working through something clearly difficult to articulate. "You're right," he finally said. "I built my entire understanding of protecting you around the assumption that protection meant control. Controlling information, controlling access, controlling the shape of the danger around you. Because that was the only model I had. Growing up in a family where protection and control were essentially the same word. I am going to have to learn a different way of doing this if we're going to build something that lasts. A way that includes you as a partner in the decisions, not just a person I'm trying to keep safe from a distance." "I'd like that," Isabella said softly, and meant it completely. The formal resolution of Serena Volpe's threat came through channels that operated far outside conventional law enforcement, though the specifics remain something Marco discussed with Isabella only in careful, measured terms, enough for her to understand the danger had been permanently neutralized without requiring details that would have forced her into complicity with methods she preferred not to examine too closely. Serena's remaining organization, leaderless and formally sanctioned by the council, dissolved within weeks,
its territory absorbed by rival families eager to claim what she could no longer defend, and the particular chapter of danger that had shaped the last 3 years of Isabella's life finally, definitively closed. What replaced it in the weeks that followed was something Isabella hadn't fully allowed herself to imagine during the darkest days of her exile in New York. An actual life, built deliberately rather than in reaction to crisis, with a man who had spent 3 years proving, in the hardest possible terms, exactly how far he was willing to go to protect the people he loved. She signed the lease on the harbour-adjacent office space 2 weeks after the warehouse confrontation, officially expanding Isabella Moretti events into a second city. A decision that felt less like compromise and more like genuine choice, made with clear eyes and full knowledge of exactly what she was building toward. Sophia adjusted to her expanded family with the effortless resilience of a child too young to fully understand the complicated history behind her father's presence, simply delighted to have a parent who read bedtime stories in a deep, careful voice, and who had, within a month of moving in together, learned every single one of her preferences with an attentiveness that occasionally brought tears to Isabella's eyes when she witnessed it. The particular way Sophia liked her sandwiches cut, the stuffed rabbit that had to be tucked in beside her every night, the specific song that calmed her during thunderstorms. "You're good at this," Isabella told him one evening, watching through the doorway as Marco navigated Sophia's elaborate bedtime negotiation tactics with a patience that would have surprised anyone who knew him only through his reputation in the city's underworld. "I had 3 years to imagine what this might feel like," Marco admitted, joining her in the hallway once Sophia had finally, successfully, been convinced to actually sleep. "I used to lie awake, wondering if I'd ever get the chance to do this. Read a bedtime story, negotiate about vegetables, learn all the small things a father is supposed to know about his child. I don't intend to waste a single day of the chance I've been given now that I have it." Isabella leaned into him, letting herself fully rest against his chest in a way she'd been cautiously withholding for weeks, some final wall finally dissolving under the accumulated weight of everything they'd survived together. "I used to lie awake wondering the same thing," she admitted. "Whether Sophia would ever know her father, whether I'd ever stop being angry enough to let her have that, even if the opportunity somehow arose. I'm glad I was wrong about how that story was going to end." 6 weeks after the warehouse, on a warm evening in early autumn, Marco asked Isabella to marry him for the second time. He did it without the 600 guests, without the cathedral, without the elaborate production of their first engagement. Instead, he arranged for a quiet dinner on the penthouse terrace, Sophia already asleep, Rosa having discreetly excused herself for the evening. And when Isabella stepped outside to find the terrace lit with candles and Marco standing at the railing with an unmistakable nervousness she'd rarely seen from him, she understood immediately what was about to happen. "I know how this looks," he said before she'd even reached him, the words tumbling out with an urgency that suggested he'd rehearsed this moment many times and still couldn't quite manage the composure he'd hoped for. A second proposal, after everything that went wrong with the first one. "I know I don't have the right to expect this to go differently, or the right to ask you to trust that a wedding day with me won't end the same way it did 3 years ago." "Marco, let me finish, please." His hands were visibly unsteady as he pulled a small box from his jacket pocket, not the elaborate diamond he'd chosen 3 years earlier. She recognized this immediately. A smaller, simpler ring,
something that looked less like a statement of wealth and more like something chosen with deliberate, personal care. I'm not asking you to marry the version of me that existed 3 years ago, the man who thought protecting you meant making every decision alone, keeping you in the dark, prioritizing my own guilt-driven calculations over your right to make informed choices about your own life. I'm asking you to marry the man I've had to become, in the process of nearly losing you twice. Someone who understands that love isn't about control, isn't about unilateral sacrifice, isn't about deciding on my own what's best for the people I love without their voice in that decision. I am asking you to build a partnership with me, Isabella, not a rescue, not a protection detail, a partnership with all the messy, complicated, equal footing that requires. Isabella's eyes had filled with tears somewhere in the middle of his speech. 3 years of grief finally, completely transforming into something that felt, for the first time since a cathedral full of white lilies, entirely, uncomplicatedly joyful. "Yes," she said, before he'd even fully finished asking the question, before he'd gotten down on one knee, before the traditional shape of the moment had even fully arrived. "Yes, Marco, I'll marry you. Not because I've forgotten what the last 3 years cost either of us, but because I understand now, completely, that everything you did, every choice, every sacrifice, every impossible calculation, came from a love I never should have doubted, even when the shape of it looked like betrayal." He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that had finally steadied, and kissed her with a tenderness that carried the full weight of everything they'd survived to arrive at this particular candlelit evening. A proposal built not on the elaborate performance of their first engagement, but on the hard-won, deliberately chosen foundation of a love that had been tested by fire and had emerged, against every reasonable expectation, stronger for having survived it. "There's something else," Marco said, once the kiss finally broke, his expression turning more serious. "I don't want another wedding like the first one. No 600 guests, no cathedral full of people who spent 3 years gossiping about our humiliation. I want something small, family. People who actually love us, rather than people attending because attendance is politically required. And I want it soon, Isabella. I've already lost 3 years I can't get back. I don't want to lose a single unnecessary day more." "Small," Isabella agreed, laughing through tears that hadn't yet stopped falling. "And soon. I think I've had quite enough of elaborate weddings, honestly, given how the last one turned out." They were married 5 weeks later, in the small garden behind her parents' house, with fewer than 30 guests. Both sets of parents, a handful of close friends, Sophia as an exuberant, entirely too enthusiastic flower girl who scattered rose petals with the reckless abandon of a child given a task she considered the single greatest responsibility of her young life. There was no 600-person cathedral audience, no elaborate press coverage, no careful political calculation about which families needed to be invited to maintain fragile alliances. There was only the people who had actually earned a place in the story of two people who had been torn apart by violence and had found their way back to each other through 3 years of patient, painful, ultimately triumphant persistence. Salvatore walked Isabella down a short aisle of folding chairs, arranged on his own back lawn, his composure holding this time all the way to the small altar where Marco stood waiting. No vanishing act, no envelope of cash, no explanation required beyond the steady, unwavering presence of a man who had spent 3 years proving exactly how far he was willing to go to earn the right to stand there. "I love you," Marco said, when it came time for vows, abandoning the traditional script they'd prepared in favour of something simpler, something that carried the full weight of everything they'd survived together. I loved you enough to destroy everything we had once in order to save your life. I love you enough now to spend the rest of my life proving that choice was never a betrayal, only the hardest, most necessary act of love I have ever been capable of. I promise you, Isabella, no more secrets, no more choices made alone. Whatever comes next, we face it together, or we don't face it at all. I love you, Isabella replied, her voice steady despite the tears streaming freely down her face. Enough to have spent 3 years hating a man who never stopped loving me, and enough now to forgive that hatred completely. Because I finally understand it was never really about you at all. It was about surviving a wound I didn't yet know had a different shape than I believed. I promise you the same, Marco. No more running. No more facing danger alone to prove I don't need protecting. Just partnership, for whatever life gives us next. They kissed as husband and wife, beneath a canopy of string lights, in a backyard that held none of the grandeur of Santa Chiara, and Isabella understood in that moment that this, not the elaborate cathedral wedding that had once represented her entire idea of happiness, but this small, imperfect, deeply earned celebration, was the truest version of the life she had actually wanted all along. 2 years later, Isabella stood on the same penthouse terrace where Marco had proposed for the second time, watching the harbour lights flicker on across the water as evening settled over the city, and allowed herself a rare moment of simply appreciating how completely her life had transformed since the day she'd walked out of Santa Chiara, alone in a wedding dress that had cost more than her mother's car. Isabella Moretti Events had grown into a business with offices in 3 cities, a client roster that included some of the most prominent families on the East Coast, and a reputation built entirely on the foundation Isabella had constructed with her own hands during the hardest years of her life. Proof, she often thought, that the worst thing that ever happened to her had also, indirectly, forged the resilience that made everything afterward possible. Sophia, now 5, and possessed of an increasingly formidable will that both her parents recognized, with a mixture of pride and exhausted amusement as an inheritance from both sides of her family, had recently acquired a baby brother, Matteo, 3 months old, currently asleep in his father's arms, as Marco joined Isabella on the terrace, moving with the particular careful stillness of a man determined not to wake a finally sleeping infant. "He's out," Marco murmured, settling into the chair beside her, Matteo's small form tucked securely against his chest. Sophia informed me in great detail that babies who don't sleep enough grow up to be cranky, and that I should take this very seriously. "She's not wrong," Isabella said, smiling, reaching over to gently stroke her son's dark hair, darker than Sophia's, though the same unmistakable green eyes had already begun to assert themselves, a detail that had made Marco go quietly, uncharacteristically emotional the day they'd finally settled clearly enough to be certain. "Where is our resident expert on infant sleep science, anyway?" "Rose is reading her a story. Something about a princess who runs her own kingdom without needing a prince to save her, I believe, which Sophia selected herself and has apparently decided is her new favourite." Isabella laughed, the sound easy and unguarded in a way that would have seemed impossible to imagine 3 years into her exile in New York, building a life entirely without the man now sitting beside her with their sleeping son in his arms. "I wonder where she gets that from." "I can't imagine," Marco said dryly, though the warmth in his eyes betrayed how much he adored exactly that particular trait in his daughter. The city around them had settled over the past 2 years into a fragile but durable peace. The power vacuum left by Serena Volpe's fall had been carefully managed by the council, territory redistributed among families willing to maintain the old equilibrium rather than risk another destabilizing war. And Marco's own organization had shifted its energy, gradually, toward legitimate business interests that Isabella had watched him build with the same methodical patience he'd once applied to hunting down the threats against her. It wasn't a complete transformation. Some parts of that world she'd come to understand never fully disappeared, only evolved into quieter, more careful shapes. But it was enough of a shift that she no longer woke in the night certain a black sedan was waiting outside, no longer flinched at unexpected knocks on the door, no longer carried the particular vigilance that had defined the first anxious months of their reunion. "Do you ever think about it?" Isabella asked, watching the harbour lights multiply as full evenings settled over the water. "The wedding that never happened. What our lives would have looked like if that plot had never existed, if you'd never had to disappear." Marco was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the careful thoughtfulness he brought to everything that mattered. "Sometimes. I think about the version of us that might have had a simpler road, married at 27, no 3-year separation, no grief to work through before we could build this." He glanced down at their sleeping son, then across at her, something fierce and grateful moving behind his eyes. "But I don't know if that version of us would have understood what we have now the way we do. We built this on top of the worst thing either of us ever survived. That has to count for something. The fact that we came out the other side of it, not just intact, but stronger than either of us was before." "I used to think the worst day of my life was standing in that cathedral, waiting for a man who never came," Isabella said quietly. "I don't think that anymore. I think the worst day of my life gave me the family I have now, eventually, even though it took the long way around to get there. That doesn't make it hurt less, looking back, but it does make it easier to forgive." Marco reached over with his free hand, finding hers in the growing dark, and Isabella laced her fingers through his with the easy familiarity of a woman who had, after everything, the abandonment, the grief, the danger, the long, difficult work of rebuilding trust from wreckage, finally found her way to a love that had survived its own destruction and emerged, against every reasonable expectation, unbreakable. "I love you," Marco said, the same 3 words he'd said on a terrace 2 years earlier, the same 3 words that had once cost him everything to withhold and now cost him nothing at all to give. Freely, completely, every single day. "I love you too," Isabella answered, and meant it with the full, unguarded certainty of a woman who had finally, after everything, come home. Inside, Sophia's voice carried faintly through the open terrace doors, narrating the final triumphant page of her chosen bedtime story to a patiently listening Rosa. Something about a princess who built her own kingdom and never needed rescuing, because she had already learned somewhere along the way that she had been strong enough to save herself all along. Isabella smiled, listening to her daughter's small, confident voice carry through the penthouse she now called home, and thought that there was no better lesson she could hope her children would carry forward. Not that love meant needing to be rescued, but that the truest kind of love was the kind built by 2 people who had each learned, the hard way, exactly how to save themselves, and had chosen, afterward, to build something enduring together anyway. The city lights spread out below them, endless and glittering, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Isabella Caruso felt no fear looking out at them at all. Only the quiet, hard-won certainty of a life, finally, fully her own.